All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is another episode of Roundtabletoptalk. And in fact, it is episode 2. And I really look forward to when it's episode 3 because that means that it's R3T number 3. And I think R3T is a perfect way to describe Roundtabletoptalk because that is indeed 3. And I have 3 other people here with me. And that's obviously Mask, Keyan, and Veek. What's going on, guys?
Hi. Hi.
The threes have nearly aligned. Just need that one more episode.
Yep. And it seems like we have plenty to talk about. I remember thinking, is this just going to be a one-shot? Or is this going to be one of those things where we actually just talk about stuff for a long time? And, well, turns out there was a lot to say in the very first episode and then a lot to do afterwards. So, for those unaware, we do have a page on the Zabalba subdirectory or whatever on the website where we're going to be referencing some progress that has been made. I've mostly kept this like under wraps. It doesn't get hyperlinked anywhere, but if you can do what Veek did and guess the actual URL, it's not very arcane, you might be able to get access to it. But the point is, we've been working on stuff. I've been trying to put together some idea of a system. Since the last time, I remember we had a bit of a discussion in the last episode about combat phases, turns and actions, that sort of thing, like the action economy. And we also discussed some stuff about, how would you actually scale up the power of the players. And so those are 2 central topics that I want to cover in this episode. The first of those will be the turns and actions, because that's very fundamental. So I'll tell you guys what I settled on, and you guys can tell me what you think. So obviously the turns being simultaneous or whatever is something that we're not really 100% sure how well it would work out. What I was thinking is, instead of worrying about like, oh, here's one team going and then here's another team going, everybody would simply log their actions and then they would all play out at the same time after I had accounted for like, okay, what is the results of this and that. And I think that's an interesting play. Now, there were some discussions in the last Big Boys table that was almost 4 hours long, by the way, where Mesk and I were discussing, here's like, how that might work, and here's some issues where you might want to like metagame because you know all of the outcomes or all the details. And so you have to have a game master that isn't going to change stuff, basically, or isn't going to want to change stuff too much or whatever and go back on and do a different action. And you have to find some way to make it so that the players actually present all of their stuff to you without knowing what the other people are doing or whatever. Like maybe you can even do some sort of role-playing check where if you're fighting an enemy and the enemy like gets really angry looking and defiant looking or something, then maybe that means that they're being provoked to attack. And so you can kind of like read that and be like, oh, okay, I know what they're doing. So like there could be stuff like that would explain things, that would give you a little bit of a hint. And I think that could be cool. But the main idea here is that you don't have to like wait your turn in a really long sequence. Everybody does their turn at the same time. And like once they've specified what their turn is actually going to be, like I'm going to target this guy, or I'm going to like raise my shield to defend myself from this direction or from this person, specifically trying to defend myself from like the enemy that's at this coordinate or something. Like if that's what your action is and all that stuff, then that can be great. And we go back to the idea of the execution versus the preparation. And in this case, you can like do some sort of hybrid sometimes too, where like basically one of your actions might be like, I'm going to attack, but in a way that doesn't break my shield guard. So I'm going to like not swing my sword with abandon. I'm just going to like sort of thrust it forward or whatever. And that way it's not going to break my guard. Or I'm going to like completely lower my shield so I can get a better attack on, or I'm not going to, raise my sword at all. I'm just going to like fully protect myself from my shield. Like those 3 actions are all like the one action that character can do in that turn, but they all do different things with the same sort of weaponry, and they lead to different outcomes. So like the preparation side of that spectrum would definitely be just protecting myself with my shield. The sword swing with abandon would be the execution side, and then like there's the hybrid of like trying to do both. And so it's not like cleanly a binary thing where it's always one or the other, but I think that's like a way to conceptualize how actions could be perceived. And the idea that everybody like sort of specifies their thing, what their action is going to be, especially if we end up going with the text-based client that that Veek and I were talking about in one of the sessions, it would be really cool, I think, to have everything work out in the way where everybody can submit their action. They can say, this is what I want to do with my turn. And then the game master can decide like, okay, well, based on what the other characters also did and said, like, here, what are the actual resolutions? And like, I think hopefully that would mean that combat resolves faster, or at least like individual turns go faster. And also that everybody like gets to go without like worrying about, oh, am I going to get stunned before my turn is? Like, shout out fucking Divinity, by the way. So that's our situation that we're in right now with the initial idea of combat, where everybody does go at the same time, but combat gets resolved by the game master once they know all of the actions. And ideally, they would not have the players reveal their actions until after like the NPCs had already been locked in, because then like there's no temptation whatsoever to metagame. So like everybody would have their actions revealed to the game master at the same time, basically once they were done. And then, yeah, like those are just some of the initial ideas. So what does that make everybody think of? Because that's obviously already very different than how you normally conventionally do actions. Because like I basically don't want an initiative stat that you try to game so that you can always go before anybody else. And I also really don't like the idea of this team will always go before that team, because you still are trying to like figure out how can you go before the other team. And if the other team happens to be really big, like, oh, okay, well, there's like 6 people that are going to go before the 2 of us or something, like that could be really bad too. So anyway, what do you guys reckon? Anything that comes to mind when I explain this system? Any concerns you have, or any things that like makes you think, oh yeah, that would really work out?
Yeah, so like back when we discussed it the first time, I thought about this like logging, and I thought it was pretty cool, but also had like we weren't exactly sure how we would do it, right? And I think the way you have like distilled it in this implementation, I think it's really really great, because it's like simplifies it, and it seems to get the best out of both worlds, where we have like the sim turns, and also like there's simplicity of only one resource. There's no like there's like little complexity and maximum flexibility, which is I think what you described it as, and I think that's really neat. Obviously, we don't know what sim turns exactly will mean, because I don't think there was a tabletop with sim turns, or at least I haven't experienced one yet.
I haven't seen one that does anything like this, but maybe I don't even, that's the thing about like trying to use another client for this, by the way, guys, is like if we try to use Roll20 or one of the many alternatives that are on the market, I don't even know if you can like set the game up to work this way. So that's like another thing. I have no idea. That might mandate that we basically do with no client initially or something, or like not actually using it for the turn part. Because I don't know if you could even configure it.
With the text problem, it might actually be fairly doable.
Yeah, I mean, so to explain the text prompt system, basically the way that I would describe it is, say you're like standing, you've got a explosive round, and there's like a barrel full of like explosive munitions, and also like a character, and so you you've got 2 different pistols equipped, and you can say like, I want to attack this target, and like you would type like attack and then some sort of prefix that indicates you want to target. And then it would show you a list of valid targets automatically, like it would kind of calculate that. And so there would be the barrel of explosives, and then there would be the character, like from the list that you could pick from. And then you would say, like, after you pick your target, you would say with, and then some sort of prefix that indicates a weapon, and then it would show you
I think you wouldn't even
weapons.
need the prefix, actually, because when you say with, that could automatically prompt it.
If it can parse the fact that you said attack first, and then like it gives you like
it was something I thought I could implement. So.
Yeah, like it depends on how advanced or the parsing can actually be. But basically, the idea is that you can auto-complete your action idea or whatever, and then it will basically it'll give the game master a sample event of what it thinks will happen, and the game master can decide, does something extra happen? Is there something else that I need to account for? Like, this would be a case where do you want to have them dodge it or something, I guess. Like that would be a little bit more on the metagamey side, I guess. But like the point is, like, is there something that needs to be added into this game event? Like it basically prompts the game master with the event that the character is doing or begetting, right? And so that would be like the text autocomplete thing there. But you don't even need to think about that for the purpose of the sim turn stuff. It's just like, do you guys think basically that the simultaneous turns would work out in the context of everybody types their action, and then like their actions are revealed to the game master if they're a player character? Their actions are revealed after the game master locks in his own actions for all the NPCs, and then like you get to see the combat play out. I guess the only thing I would be a little bit concerned about describing it like that is it might feel like everything happens a little bit too fast or something. or like maybe a little anticlimactic because like you spend all this time like locking down your action, and then all of a sudden like it occurs in 6 seconds or whatever it is, right?
How do you deal with mutually exclusive events?
Well, that would have to be down to the game master to resolve for sure. But I think that would be easy to do on an intuitive case by case basis.
What would be a mutually exclusive event anyway?
Like you shoot somebody before
Two
they
people
can
shoot
move.
each other in the head. Someone manipulates an object that would prohibit somebody else from doing
Yeah, so
something on their
bullets take
turn.
time to travel, right? So they would just both shoot themselves. I think.
If you're shooting with lasers or whatever, their speed of light, you're 5 feet away from each other. Who shot first?
Yeah,
Who
a
moved
Han
the door
Solo
first?
move,
Who
yeah.
disarmed someone that was going to fire? Like, you're going to end up with salt one way or another, no matter how you resolve that, because it basically comes down to either having a speed stat, which is only a halfway solution because people can have the same speed stat, or it comes down to you just arbitrarily making decisions.
Well, I think the best. Oh, go ahead, Keyan.
Sorry, just two quick things to throw in here. I wanted to go back very briefly to your sword and shield example.
Yeah.
I want to say that I enjoyed imagining the parallel that draws with ranged weapons as well, where like the expeditious action could just be like blind firing from behind cover.
Yeah.
The safe play could be, taking like waiting for the right time to shoot. And then also, it seems like you're taking a good first step towards resolving a really big issue in like 5th edition, for example, and probably all tabletop games, which is you can have a player who's really familiar with the game and they'll actually be ready to take their turn and know exactly what they're going to do. And then some like really obscure game mechanic will just completely negate their entire turn because they couldn't actually do what they were trying to do. And then they have to spend the next 10 minutes figuring out their turn again.
Well, is there an example that comes to mind of that behavior happening, like an obscure mechanic destroying a turn? Because I want to know what that actually would be. I feel like that's really dumb, but
I mean, it happens all the time with spell casting, or like if you didn't read the specific rules as written way that a feature was supposed to work, and it could just be like, oh yeah, I want to go grapple this creature, but I didn't know that this creature's size was like large or huge and not medium, so now I can't grapple this creature anymore. So that's like, and I based my next 3 turns off of grappling that creature, so now I have to sit here and rethink the whole fucking thing.
Right, okay. Well, yeah, having the text prompt stuff does help with resolve that because it basically gives you a list of valid things. Ideally, it would be more permissive than restrictive because I don't know, I don't know if the game master can because the other thing is if your action that you want to do isn't actually in the autocomplete, you can just write what you want your action to do and the game master can decide if it works. So that's another thing is if we don't have to catch everything in the client, we can leave room for the game master to resolve an action that is more outside the box, and maybe that should even be encouraged, although I don't know how common it would actually be. But if you have some sort of trait or ability or something and we can't configure it to be a conventional cast or something, that would be something that might act in that way or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I don't know. There's definitely room for that. Mesk's concern about the simultaneous turns resulting in you having to resolve exclusive actions. I feel like part of what you can do for that is, again, you can have perceptive players and reads to some degree for what is going to happen, which doesn't need to be definitive or binary or whatever. It doesn't always have to be the same thing, but the example I gave is the enemy starts getting a very stern look and reaches for their weapon or something. It's okay, well, they're probably going to try to shoot me with their laser pistol or something. So I can plan around that. The other thing that you can do with that is if somebody's going to throw an obstacle at a player.
Well, I wasn't really talking about planning. I meant when it actually happens. Let's say you've got a fight and you got 2 guys already pointing guns at each other. And you as the GM has decided, well, this guy's going to shoot because he's got 1 HP anyways. He's going to try to go down with a bang.
Yeah.
And the player has also got 1 HP, and the player's well, I'm going to go down. I may as well try to shoot him in case he tries to run or something, and maybe I get a 1-off. But actually, they're both going to fire at the exact same time. They're both within 5 feet of each other. Let's say there's no chance for them to miss.
Yeah.
Who do you resolve who shoots first and who gets shot in the head first and who dies first? There's other examples. Like there's a million different things you can come up with.
Yeah.
Like somebody uses an action to close a door on somebody
Right.
who's about to like throw a grenade or shoot them or something like that. How do you resolve when they throw it, or does the door close first? Right. Like there's a lot of mutually exclusive stuff that can either completely eliminate a turn, like disarming when someone's going to shoot a gun, or completely change the outcome of something depending on how it's ruled. That's going to be, you're going to have to resolve every single one of those every single time they come up. And they're going to happen even if you have like all the reads and stuff associated with it. Like, oh, he's going to close the door. Well, I'm going to shoot my gun before he closes the door. But they're all the same action occurring at the same time. So how are you going to resolve all that?
Yeah, I think the door example, I mean, it would funnily enough depend on what door it was, because some doors will probably close faster or slower than others. Some doors will be made of different materials than others. Like if you're shooting a high power projectile through a thin wooden door, it's probably not going to even protect anyway.
No, well, it's going to be contextually relevant. But I'm talking like there's a door and a crack of like a blast door, and a guy's got like a 9mm. Like the door will stop the projectile.
Yeah.
I'm talking explicitly about mutually exclusive stuff, not like what ifs, but things that will nullify an action or completely change the context of an action to the point that the context or viability of a turn completely changes depending on which one is resolved in what order. Because there will still be an order. They occur at once, but there's going to be an order in how they're resolved when cases like this happen.
And I think the order of resolution, realistically speaking, I would try my best to resolve the action as if everything had happened at the same time, which means like in the case of two people aiming their laser gun, nobody shoots like first per se. They both shoot at the same time. They just kill each other. Yeah. And then like in the case of the door, it's like, well, again, it comes down to context. Like, does it close fast enough to block the projectile? If so, then the projectile gets blocked, or like it has to go through the door or whatever. And like, that's just going to be something where I think what you're going to see out of that experience is it'll actually be fine in aggregate, because people will start to learn like how that works.
I feel like the client would do a lot of the heavy lifting anyway.
In what way?
Like, you're just like, it would. I feel like it would just make sense if you've seen it actually like visualized. If you actually have like the simulation of things that happen in which order. Obviously, there are still like the examples that Mesk brought up, but I just feel like when the client is actually there and you can see how it happens, it would actually make a lot of sense, like intuitively. But I might also do. We'll just see how it is when.
Well, it's a good thing to be like, that's why I asked you guys about were there any concerns with the system or whatever, because that's definitely like the simultaneous turn thing is like outer edge, bleeding edge technology in most people's minds. Like, it's not something that most people think about. I'm sure I'm not the only one I've ever thought of it, but the point is like, you're not going to find a game system like the vast majority of tabletop game systems that work this way. So either way, as far as like resolving stuff, like on the one hand, like the game master, as with everything, the game master is like the one who should be on the fair side. And by fair, I don't mean like making it easy for the player all the time. I mean just fair. Like, is it reasonable? And they can be the ultimate attenuator of like maybe a poorly thought out system initially gets eroded into a fix or something. So in that context, like, I'm sure there's going to be some things that are like, growing pains of the system where, somebody tries to shoot and somebody else tries to disarm. And it's like, well, maybe the gunshot goes off, but if it doesn't kill the person who was trying to disarm them, then they still successfully disarm them afterwards or something. Like, I'm sure there could be things like that that could happen. And again, if we imagine that we like have enough of an intuition, like you might, so say you're like in a fight with a guy who can do this grappling disarm move, and maybe this is like everybody, I don't know what the context is, but they might have dialogue before you start fighting them where they talk about how they had to restrain and disarm a person. So like you can kind of tell, that I shouldn't be so close to them with my ranged weapon if that's the case, because they've already said that they could do that or whatever. Like that can be like a simple thing that's just like, hey, by the way, like reminder, this mechanic does exist, and so you got to kind of play around that. And again, that goes back to the reads basically, is like whatever the case may be where there could be an effect or could be a mutually exclusive event that kind of nullifies a turn the way that Mesk is talking about. first of all, we hope that the time to kill in the game is not fast enough that like you can actually die in one turn unless everybody's really focusing you, and hopefully that doesn't happen too often based on the way that you take your fights. But second of all, it's like, you know, if we reduce the significance of each individual turn to the point where like each turn is a stepping stone towards victory or defeat and not like a giant leap towards it. The other thing that we can do with that is we can say, hey, you guys don't have to worry too much about like being completely snapped out of existence in one turn. So you can, and you can also take this opportunity to like pay more attention to what the state of the battlefield is, right? And so, like as part of the resolution of actions, I think I would also be intimating for each NPC what they were like, what their state was. So like again, reminding the player of the read is like, you know, does he still look like determined, or does he have some fear in his eye? And if he has some fear in his eye, maybe he's going to turn tail and run. Maybe he's going to do something more defensive. Like that could be like a simple thing.
Actually,
Right?
it makes me think that if we do use sim turns, that actually means that we actually have more turns in our disposal to actually resolve situations, right? It's like you said that we wouldn't want turns to necessarily that one turn like decides the outcome or whatever. It's just like a step. So if we actually have sim turns, that means that it's actually we save like however many players you have times that probably is the amount of time you save. So you can just increase the amount of turns thanks to that, I think. But
yeah, combat
we'll
basically can go
practice.
fast enough with the context of the sim turns being there, because if combat is resolving, like individual turns within combat are taking less time to resolve, partially because everybody can go at once and then the game master can resolve everything at once, and then like we see what the outcomes are. Like again, as long as that ends up being satisfying for the players, then I don't know that there's going to be too much of an issue, purely on the basis of like, here's a list of things that like the player can do, and then they do the thing, and then okay, now they're not like fully crippled and destroyed and stunned or whatever after turn one, and their enemies are not either. So like the game is like, it's still a live combat encounter, and it's not like about to be resolved after one turn. So you can go a couple turns deep without it actually dragging on. It can still be engaging, right? So it's kind of like, funnily enough, there's like an obvious parallel where if we try to like raise the floor of durability in CMBW or lower the ceiling of damage or whatever, it's like, okay, we've rebalanced the game to take a little bit longer to resolve. Like workers have a lot more HP, and then like as a simple example. So if you want to kill a bunch of workers, then you got to commit a little bit harder to it. That's kind of the same thing that I'm talking about with this is, I don't know how the economy works for HP and stuff in D&D. Obviously, there's armor class, which is just a total goofy-ass system that is like a binary hit or miss, and it's based on like dice rolls a lot of the time. So it's really silly. But beyond that, it's okay. Can we imagine a system where like I guess this is a question for Keyan and Mesk. Is conventional D&D like 5th edition, does it have this problem where like people die in one hitter or are completely nullified in one turn? Or
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, funny story.
Okay.
In a campaign that I played in, I had a character with a negative constitution modifier. He had a -3 to his constitution.
Okay.
So the dungeon master rolled that every time I leveled up, and we were rolling for HP, mind you, I would have to subtract 3 from my HP rolls.
What the fuck?
So there were like multiple levels where I would roll a 1 on my HP, and I would lose hit points for leveling up.
Amazing.
That's rules as written, yeah.
So I would when on our first or second session of the game, I had a level 10 character with 32 hit points. And the very first enemy that attacked me did 64 damage, and my character died instantly.
Yeah.
Because if an attack does double your maximum hit points, you do not make death saving throws. You just die.
You just die. So the giblets rule.
That's gorgeous. I love that. How did an enemy deal 60 damage to you at level 10?
It cast like a 5th level spell or some shit.
I wasn't aware any of the 5th level spells did 60 damage. Holy shit.
I
thought it took like Ray of Disintegration or whatever to deal that much damage.
I can't remember what its spell it was, but it might have been something homebrew that the DM made.
Oh,
that it was just like overtuned.
Classic.
Yeah, if you have negative constitution, when you level up, you take, well, you can roll for your health, and then it's your con modifier. If your con modifier is negative, then you will go into negative health. Yeah, I gave some examples. I think it was in BBT.
Yep.
Where you can be nullified for, like, fear rules is written. You can't move towards the subject of your fear. And HKS got feared in the last fight of Albion 2. And actually, this happened elsewhere too. I can't remember where it was. But since it was open arena, you basically could never approach the boss, and he was melee. So the boss kind of just walked around killing his team while he just kind of had to sit there and do nothing. And there's other cases too. I used to have even like one turn paralysis on a lot of things. Well, not really a lot of things, but things that like major fights in general. And you could get hit by paralysis, and just getting locked out of that one turn, depending on the context, that can lock you out for over half the fight. Because when you think about it, even though I had these longer fights that lasted like 2 sessions, the amount of actual rounds that you went through was not really enormous. I would have to check. But I think before we got into Autumn Wind, I hashed out that the longer fights resolved in like 7 to 8 rounds, which isn't really that long. And when you think about it on like a larger map, depending on your class, if you don't have any ranged options or spells, you have to use dash, your dash action to move 60 feet. And that locks you out of a turn. You can't do anything more at that point, other than like your bonus or an item interaction or something like that. But as far as like actual major actions are concerned, dash will take all of them. So there's other cases too where things can happen, like not even being stunned or CC'd, but you know, the way like certain spells will work, like haste, for example. When haste ends, you lose your next turn. So that's supposed to be the counterbalance for haste, giving you an extra action on your turn. But as I also mentioned, it is very possible to get fucked by a LMAO dice like Luller Skates did, where you roll a 1 on a concentration check from an ally that deals 1 damage to you because the minimum DC is always 10. And if you're not sitting on a monstrous con modifier, which most spellcasters aren't, you will just lose it instantly, which means you can cast haste, get interrupted by somebody using a rage ability nearby, and then just instantly lose your next turn anyways. So now, keeping in mind, however, that you still have your AC while this is happening. You have your AC while you're unconscious. You have your AC while you're asleep. And enemies can and will miss you, even with advantage attacks. And it has happened. And just because you're incapacitated doesn't even necessarily mean you're actually in danger.
Amazing.
And also, I would throw in too that the whole stunning thing is why a lot of people don't like monks, because monks can make with like 4 attacks in a turn, up to even more if you hit
every
them.
one of those can be a stun attempt.
Yeah, every single one can be a stun attempt.
Yep.
It sounds like they would love to play monks, but not necessarily anything else.
Well, monks don't really scale that. Like, the stunning is good, but they don't really deal a lot of damage into later on levels. So they really just become there just to be the one-trick pony of just constantly stunning shit.
Yeah. CC bot or whatever. Yeah, it's really silly. I mean, the whole, like, taking away action always feels terrible, but it would feel less terrible in a simultaneous turn context where you would be able to get your action off to some degree. And then if you were going to be stunned or have some sort of disable applied to you, then at the very least you got a turn, and ideally it would take longer than 1 turn to fully apprehend and disable somebody anyway. So like I feel like that would
fear,
go
I made it you can approach at half speed.
Okay.
Like, that was one change I made to kind of go in the direction you're talking about, is I just errated fear completely. And
as you should, judging by what you told me.
It's really strong.
Well, it also has like a disproportionately negative impact to one class.
One class, because if you're ranged, you can still attack them. I can't remember if it was a disadvantage or whatever, but you could still like try to attack them.
Yeah.
But if you're melee, it's like you have to get close.
It's also really hard for it to be believable when you're trying to roleplay. If
you're like some kind of like living god, like level, like this wasn't like super high levels, but it was still fairly high level. It's like you can be afraid But you can still try to fight what you're afraid of. The fact it would completely paralyze you in spot and be unable to approach even by a single foot is like, you can see that affecting commoners. Right?
Yeah, it
But
might
not
it might
like,
as well have just been a stun effect and not a fear effect.
Yeah.
Because of what it
Basically.
does.
Yeah.
I was going to run an Icewind Dale campaign for some people in real life. It only got like 2 or 3 sessions in because we had to stop playing, but even though it was something that was like already written, I actually went through the campaign guide for the story and I just started redoing everything myself because they give you content to work with, but a lot of it is really bland or like not finished. And it's just a lot better when you give things a personal touch.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's why.
Yeah, the pre-written adventures are pretty bad.
It's one of the reasons why I look at the setting or whatever. Like one of the other things that I did recently when I was working more on the tabletop planning is I actually wrote out some more descriptions for the short adventure, and it's like, there's definitely like an interesting angle to a lot of how it works because it's all, if you're remotely familiar with the setting, or even if you're not, your character will be familiar with some things in the setting, obviously. So your character would know there's not really a reason for us to still be alive. Like for some reason we were collected instead of being like rendered down into, base material by these like collection automata. So why are we like not, why haven't we been turned into minerals basically is like what you're going to be wondering. And so like that's going to be the initial hook for like the mystery. And then on top of it, it's like, well, we are also like in a hostile vessel, so we have to like fend for ourselves kind of deal. So you get this mix of I'm scared for my own personal safety, and I don't know why I'm even still alive. What's going on? So
Well, the answer is obviously because Skithercore sniped this command center.
Got him. Absolutely.
The Nexus.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Nexus. Got them both.
So the thing I look at for trying to build a setting for sure is like there needs to be a few layers of thing that you're worried about. Like the first layer is how can I make sure my character stays alive and safe? And the second layer in this case is like the mystery of like what's going on here. And then, there can be like additional ones that are on the subtextual level or whatever, but having those layers for like what's going on instantaneously means that you don't need to feel like it's never really going to feel aimless because you can always make progress in like improving your security, your personal safety, or improving your understanding of what's going on by like exploring the ship and stuff. So there'll be an interesting counterbalance there where it's like, do we want to set out on an expedition over to the outer skirts of the ship to some spot that we haven't like reclaimed yet or whatever. So I think that'll be a neat little touch, but we'll get there eventually. So, Keyan, I do think it's probably a good time to talk about proficiencies. And you were on the stream that I was doing. I actually haven't even uploaded that one, but the one that I was doing yesterday for about an hour or so, where you asked me about proficiencies, and I ended up writing a little bit about it. Can you give me a sort of like a Cliff Notes or like a brief summary of how you feel proficiencies work in 5th edition and like any significant issues you have with them or some things that you think they do really well?
Well, it's one of the avenues that you have for optimizing what your character can do, obviously. There is a generic list of proficiencies that all characters have access to. And then more specific things tend to come from like tools or weapon proficiencies, or things that the dungeon master creates. But it's almost, hold on, let me go to,
he's finding his way across the internet.
Yes. Just so you know what we're looking at here, I'm just going to send you a list or a screenshot.
Okay.
If I can get into this with some kind of speed. Okay.
You guys can't type single letters to indicate that you're back. What the hell?
Okay.
Hi.
So I just dropped
like a simultaneous turn.
Yeah, that
So
was
you'll see
At the same time.
that screenshot I just dropped there for you to look at has all of the 5th edition skill proficiencies, and they're all broken down by the different attribute modifiers that they're tied to.
Okay.
So I think it's a good general approach because like you can distinguish different actions that the character can take. Like it's one thing if you're just gonna like arm wrestle another character, then that could just be like a straight strength check, and you don't need to make it athletics. But if you're gonna race another character like a sprint challenge or something, then you would need to do athletics, and that kind of extends naturally to everything else in that list, if that makes sense.
So what you're basically saying is like by customizing your character down your existing idea of like what you want your character to be as a role or a class or whatever, you're also getting additional sort of
Yeah, you're increasing your ability to flavor your character and roleplay them because you can have you can have two wise characters in the same room, but if only one of them is good at being perceptive or insightful, you'll be able to see the differences between them and how they roleplay and also how they perform when they make those kinds of checks.
See, when I look at this, I just see a whole bunch of. I have linked it in the chat as well. I look at this and I do see a whole bunch of like random numbers and stuff because obviously I don't have the context of what all of these things do. But I am curious as to whether or not you think that the premise of the proficiencies in the Zabalba tabletop is at least in the right direction because you were talking about like flavoring the system and then like having roleplay opportunities. That's exactly what I want a proficiency to do in universe as well, because in my opinion, it's like when you learn a new skill, you can say you become proficient in a skill. If you've got a beginner sat right next to you and you guys have the same like base materials that you're working with, you can do things that that person can't do. You can visualize things that person can't visualize. You can like comprehend and understand things that the other person can't. So the examples of proficiencies that I gave in the write-up were a hacker recognizing important features of electronic hardware. And so like when they examine it, like the game master would provide them with that information. And then the other example would be a marksman being able to target exposed weaknesses that are too difficult for your average soldier to strike. And these two cases are both like you're basically unlocking new actions that you can do, as opposed to like in 5th edition, it seems like you can basically do an action, and if you get lucky with the dice roll, it works fine regardless of your proficiency, and if you get unlucky, it also doesn't work regardless of your proficiency, which is obviously really dumb.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
in this case, it's like you just don't have access to some actions. Like you can't do some things that an expert in this field can do, and then that would extend offer. Like we think about lock picking as a common thing that happens in the more fantasy minded stuff. Like the analog to that would actually be a hacker in sci-fi. But you think about lock picking. Well, there's going to be like a point where you're the big dog because you've got level 2 lock picking and every chest here is level 1, so you're like easily breezing through it. But there can be like some chests or some locks that are going to be higher in requirement or something, and in this context, it is just a binary, like you can't do it or you can do it. But if you could extrapolate that to more interesting things, like, can you leverage your hacking skills to make some action happen in combat? Or can you, like, I don't know, like there's all sorts of different things you could do with that. Obviously, in terms of actual combat related proficiencies, can you like hit a target in their arm to disarm them, or to like reduce their efficacy of like using their arm because you're like blowing their hand off or something, who knows. Like you can do all this stuff that you can't do normally, and that adds more options for you to take actions in the game world, which would then extend towards the idea that your character can do, because your character can do things that your fellow party members cannot do. You have that specialization, and it's not just flavor in the context of here's something like I can be wiser than you, or I can be more perceptive than you. Like it's not a can be. It is something that is like that. You are actually genuinely more better at whatever topic we're talking about because of your proficiency, and that manifests in you being able to do more actions than like the average person. So hopefully that explained it well enough anyway. But I'm curious as to what people's thoughts are of it now that I've sort of laid it out.
It feels to me like the best way to like circumvent like the binary check of it is that you would actually get more than just success and failure. You would also have some like mid-states. I'm not exactly sure how that would always work, but like for hacking, maybe you'd have like some mid state where you like learn something about the system, how the system works, but
Yeah.
still fail to like.
You would need an
open the door or
exploratory action
something,
or
right?
something to like gather information about how it works. So you can't like
It's
if
just
in
like it
combat or
feels
something.
like it would take more work for a less skilled hacker to
Yeah.
do something, but it's not like it would just binary fail on you. It's just like it's you don't really understand it. Like you have to either take more time or like it doesn't exactly work as you expected. So maybe there's like some side effect that you caused accidentally or something.
Well, there could be an analog to that where if you're imagining the marksman case, like a level 2 marksman might be able to shoot you in the hand, but a level 3 marksman can shoot you in the wrist. And so like the hand requires a couple shots, but the wrist might require only one shot. And so like that's sort of the example of the hacker is like, you know, your less skilled hacker might take longer to do it or need more actions than one to do it, but your more skilled hacker might be able to get it done in one action, right?
And might also just have a better effect if your skilled marksman hits like a really good shot. Maybe it also like it completely like paralyzes the target or something. Like you could imagine many things.
Yeah.
Paralyzing is probably not a good example since CC is kind of dumb.
Well, it would already be some sort of like effect that stops them from attacking as effectively or at all with that hand. But either way, like that's just one example, right? Like most of the time, I mean, we're talking about you being in a Resilium ship anyway. There's not really going to be a lot of hands to go around. So.
Right.
But like that's an example. Like turret hard points or whatever, you can shut them down by hitting the right part of their.
You disable
stuff.
the simulacra splitting.
Yeah, I don't know if that's possible. Good luck.
Perfect, Sean. You just shut down the splitting module. Cloning.
So
I
go ahead.
wanted to throw in, I think what you're trying to illustrate there in parallel to 5th edition, in 5th edition it's supposed to be illustrated by the capacity to overperform and beat higher difficulty checks.
Right.
So while it is still binary, what you're looking for there, like the marksman who can, shoot the needle in the haystack from a mile away, is supposed to be someone who has expertise with ranged weapons, who rolls like fucking plus 15 on their attack rolls.
Yeah. So I can see where it's supposed to be the overperforming, but I'm not even sure that it normally manifests in an additional advantage or something to that effect, right?
It does, because when you now, I mean, obviously they're still dumb where like it just doesn't work, but most of the time you'll see that the person who so there's something called cover in 5th edition, where like if a creature is partially exposed, they're considered to have like 3/4 cover or half cover and so on, and that increases their armor class by a flat amount. So if you're trying to, like, if the king is being, like walked away on his fucking throne seat and you're trying to snipe him from a long ways away, he's going to have cover, and you're going to need that expertise ranger who can make that shot, who can try to kill him from that distance.
Right. So that would give you this context where I guess it's just like an AC, like the binary check comes in later on with that.
It's really about just padding the RNG.
Yeah, and then there's also, depending on the way you describe your action, the dungeon master might decide to make the difficulty check for that higher, even if it normally isn't. So, like what you said about, like, I want to specifically target this character's head or arms or legs or something, then they're gonna have to hit a higher armor class because you're trying to be specific.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying there. Yeah, so that would make some sense to me, but I would still be somewhat wary, I guess, of the fact that, like what Mesk was just saying, is it does feel like it's kind of just padding the RNG.
It is.
And in this particular context, it's like your role-playing capacity is improved or attenuated or accentuated by your proficiencies in this context, where you can simply do things that, again, like the average person wouldn't be able to. So, like, that's what's in terms of the role-playing thing, that's what I appreciate about it, is like, obviously anybody can say I take aim towards the wrist and shoot, but if that's not actually something, I mean, I guess in the text client we could actually like unlock more sub targets for each thing, depending on your proficiency with a certain weapon or something. But like in general, you're just not going to be able to make that action. Like it would, like, you could imagine, like, as you get scaled up in power of the marksman example, like hacking the mainframe is a bit different, but trying to just shoot It's like, okay, I'm going to shoot. If a player with insufficient proficiency targets the wrist, then like maybe it expands backwards to the hand. And if the hand is still too hard to hit for them because they're that improficient, then it would just like expand to the arm or something. And like that's sort of how the game master would resolve that. They would like, oh, you don't have enough proficiency for that kind of thing. So I think that would probably be fine. But the idea is you get genuine success cases of a character with more proficiencies. And Shambler actually brought up a cool example for the hacking stuff is like maybe the less skilled hacker also like triggers the alarm when they break open the door or something, you know, stuff like that that could genuinely change the situation. But like now it's a risk because you're not skilled enough to do it silently or quietly, right? And the other thing is since you don't have experience points, then you don't have to worry about like, well, I want to trigger the alarm to kill all the guys because then I'll level up faster. Like that's not really going to help you. So. I mean, I guess it's still like an open question as to how you would say proficiencies get improved, but I think a big part of that will be your. I mean, some of it will actually be attenuated by your equipment. Like you could imagine a targeting, you know, HUD or something that would like give you like a sort of soft proficiency or something like that, like a temporary one. But in general, I think you know we would need to think about how we would scale up the proficiencies over time without it feeling cheap or stupid. Maybe that is just like basically milestone experience, but put a set of different domains and tasks, and maybe that's how we do it. So, but Mesk, do you have thoughts on proficiencies? Do they irk you? Are you mad to them? Do you think that our idea seems good? What do you think?
Everything you're talking about can already be done in 5th edition. So it's just really like down to the GM and how they write stuff and how they choose to rule things. Nothing you're really talking about. It's really like any different than how I run things, pretty much.
Okay.
I'm looking at your website right now. I didn't even know it existed before, and I haven't really had the chance to read stuff anyways. But you don't actually list any proficiencies on here, so I can't really gauge how your system would actually be any different than 5th edition. To me, from what you're describing, it sounds basically exactly the same. Pretty much the same of how I rule things. I don't know. I don't think 5th edition I know normally rules is written. There is no kind of scaling saves or something like that. But on just about everything that I have at this point, anything major, there's scaling saves involved with it. Like, let's say, for example, in normal 5th edition, you have certain dexterity saves from enemies that will either hit you or miss you, or they hit you or they deal half damage, unless you have like the evasion feature that allows you to reduce those by half, so you take half or none. I have scaling saves all over the place where, like, let's say, for example, they fought like this massive kind of demon / Gundam kind of thing. And one of its attacks is to sweep out with its claws, and it has a cleave that hits X many tiles width, X many tiles in length, depending on the angle that it uses it. And that's a scaling save where it's like, it's slow enough moving that realistically you can avoid it unless you get really caught off guard by it. But at the same time, you don't want, like, there's different levels of damage you could take from such a thing. Like, is it going to hit you head on? Is it going to graze you? So I split up the save based on the failure where, let's say, if you roll below 10, that's going to be basically a hard failure. But we could scale from 10 to 12, 13 to 15, 16 to 18, and then anything past 18 is just a full-on evasion no matter what you have.
Okay.
And the rest of it deals different damage, sometimes different effects, depending on the rate of your failure. And some of my non-combat resolutions, it really comes down to how the players choose to do something. And then I scale the success based on that. So in that sense, I'm already basically rewarding role-playing more so than just rolling the dice. I mentioned it before with dialogue and conversations.
Yeah.
I'm typically looking to go through dialogue without ever having to roll a dice unless we hit like some kind of roadblock where it feels like you need a dice to proceed in it. Particularly when they're trying to convince someone of something and someone else is trying to convince them of something opposing to it. Then that's the point where we would reach like persuasion or deception rolls and then scale based on factors related to that. For example, recently the characters found one of these NPCs they had that was in kind of like a dream, sort of, but also had our memories really scrambled up. And there was another dude there that was trying to convince her to go with him, and they were trying to convince her to go with them. And like two of the players weren't really engaging with that, and another player was busy with something else. And then you had Schwa, who was being the main conversationalist at that point. And when it came to the contest between the characters to convince this person of something, it really came down to actually like a series of roles. The enemy's persuasion, and then Schwa's persuasion, and then another resolution, which was like related to memory. And then rules is written, the way that these were rolled is that Schwa should have failed this because she didn't roll high enough. But the way that I ruled it was that because of the way things had gone and all the external factors, there was already enough doubt planted that I counted two of the rolls as one roll, and then that pushed her resolution higher. So when you look at like the proficiencies and the attributes and modifiers and stuff like that in 5th edition, a lot of those are really down to how the GM decides to roll them. Like a GM might just decide to have you roll pure strength, no proficiency for anything that requires physical exertion. And in many cases, you can probably justify that. In other cases, maybe you are rolling athletics all the time instead, because athletics is more than just about raw strength. It's about how you're using it.
Yeah.
And, you do enter certain gray areas. Like, for example, intimidation being based on charisma. You can have, like, a giant orc, and he's, like, rippling with muscle, so he's obviously very attractive, and his charisma modifier should be high, but it's very inefficient for him to actually pump stats into charisma. He has no reason to do so. He's got fucking lifting to do. He's got to be known as fucking hairy lifter, and he just has like a -2 charisma modifier, which means he tries to intimidate a peasant into giving him an apple. His modifier is -2, and the peasant has like a flat 0, so he's already less inclined to be intimidated by this orc that's like 5 times his size.
Yeah.
And like at that stage, like the DM already has to start stepping in to make actual resolutions that make more sense than what's on the board, because 5th edition was written by literal retards. And that kind of goes with everything, though, to varying extents. Like having variable success as opposed to just binary success.
Yeah.
I think that that's gonna be like one of the first things you do as a DM is start rewriting how the resolutions for stuff is handled, because the second you start actually playing this game, you're gonna feel that sting of that binary interaction.
Yeah.
That obviously gets a lot harder in combat because of things like AC, where partial success really doesn't exist in a lot of cases. But then again, when it comes to cover, I almost never have to deal with cover, because every single fucking archer in every single game runs marksman, which just ignores cover. So it's just like, this would be partial cover, this would be relevant, but they ignore it. And it only comes down to like the casters sometimes.
On the note of the intimidation thing, I have seen people homebrew where if you have a character with a really high strength modifier, they'll actually let you use your strength instead of your charisma to intimidate.
That's basically the best way to go about it, yeah.
What I don't understand is when people have like a secondary stat for like specifically for, intimidation or persuasion or whatever.
Well, the thing is, you could be a great public speaker.
Yeah.
But you could be absolutely terrible at debating. So that's where these things come in, is they try to granulate what those attributes actually mean and things. The problem with 5th edition is that they condensed a lot of stuff from the previous editions of D&D.
Yeah.
Like, the history used to be a whole bunch of different knowledge domains, because D&D was split into like knowledge of the planes, knowledge of the hells, knowledge of the celestials, and I can't remember all of them, but there was a lot of them.
Yes.
Now it's just straight history and religion. And even then, between history and religion, those two can really mesh together in ways that can be kind of difficult to granulate. So what I often do is I say you can roll one of a series of checks, and then the resolutions I give based on that check depend on what you rolled and if you had proficiency or not. So I can already just explore that diversity within the scope of 5th edition's rule sets altogether, which is why I think it might be like too early to really talk about proficiencies in your project, especially from my point of view, because I don't even see any, so I don't even have any measurement of how you might handle stuff like that, because you're probably going to be doing it in completely different ways. But you absolutely can do that kind of stuff in 5th edition, and I've already been doing it for years, just without the exception of attacks. I have thought about introducing stuff like glancing blows or whatever,
Yeah.
but for the sake of I have done it for a few things, like large armor, where they have very, very, very low AC, because it's realistically very easy to hit them.
Yes.
It's just hard to get an actual direct hit on them that'll actually deal damage. So there's some units with scaling armor, but it is kind of rare. That's really the case where we're still in the binary state. But like I said before, it tends to... There's some units with very high AC values that are supposed to be very hard to hit. And I've experimented with those fights. There's not been a lot of them. The players, like I said before, the players I play with are quite intelligent. They will navigate these fights, and they'll generally understand how to defeat these fights if they are discovering that, oh, this unit has a high AC, so it's probably something we should be using saves on, or there's some other thing we need to interact with to make this more manageable. So they usually latch onto that very, very quickly.
Mhm.
So I've been able to throw some things at them that normally would be too heavy-handed in normal D&D, especially just judging by the stories I've read over the years. And but at the same time, though, you have to scale that based on what your party is actually capable of. Like in Autumn Winds, my party was basically just a wall of meat with very, very little in the way of casting, except
okay.
the casting they did had was absurdly strong. Like, there was Force Cage, there was Silvery Barbs, there was a fair amount of healing spread throughout it. Not really like major healing, but enough that they can sustain. There was 2 rages. There was a pseudo rage, which was a cleric ability that still basically was functionally a rage, and then it gave you damage reduction. I added in things like a soothing poison effect, that if you get hit by this poison, it ends rage. They made the save against that every single time, but they did not make the save against the quelling voice, which did also remove rage. Because when we are going in fights in this game, it's usually like 1 or 2 fights per long rest. So they usually come in with full resources. So I had really no problems forcing them to burn an extra rage charge every now and then. But at the same time, there was things that couldn't really hand them, because they would not really be able to interact with it. Like things that require certain spell effects to interact with, they just don't have those spells available. So you kind of need to tailor your game to not just the players, but also to the player composition.
Yeah.
So that they do have the options to feel around for those, multiple success potentials or half success potentials, instead of like, oh, I guess you only deal physical damage, so you literally can do nothing. That's why when I had like physical resistance or physical immunity in my campaign, I started adding in tons of different kinds of ammunition you can search around for.
Yeah.
Now success kind of relies a little bit on preparation and forethought to, collect resources and then, keeping them, and then be cognizant of when to actually use them and stuff like that. And I think I gave them too many resources in general, but they've managed them very well to this point, and it's definitely worked out. Yeah, like when I think about what you were saying, it's just like, yeah, it's like, this is how I've already been running everything. You're talking about a client, which sounds like it could be quite interesting to see. That kind of interests me more to see it in actual motion. I can't really comment too much about what else you're saying in regards to like the turns and other stuff like that, because, like I said in the first discussion, it's like, I got actually out of the habit of talking about theory crafting for D&D, because so many people when I first started got so mad, and they like misinterpreted everything I was talking about constantly, or just like completely went over their heads. And I was like, no, I'm not doing this for this or that. It's like, I'm just trying to figure out what the fuck I'm doing. And but nobody ever seemed to like try to understand that. So I just kind of like got out of the habit. Like, if you're really interested in that, you can get into my Autumn Wind series, which is massive. But
I feel you there, Mesk. I've written a bunch of homebrew stuff, and anytime I would go on like the official Dungeons and Dragons Discord to try and ask people to help theory craft it and review it, I'd either get straight up ignored and nobody would ever look at it, or the people who did look at it would just have nothing but problems with it, and they wouldn't say anything good about it, and it was just always a fucking very silly experience.
And maybe things are going to be a mess, but the best way to find out is to actually put it to the test and learn from it, because that's pretty much like, especially with D&D, and when it comes down, like, you can have all these different mechanics and all these different game systems and all these different rules and whatever, but it really just comes down to the DM who's running it.
Yeah.
Because the DM is making the conscious decision to enforce this rule, to enforce that rule, to resolve things this way, to resolve things that way. I can guarantee you that just between me and Keyan, within the rule set of 5th edition, the same adventure would be run in an entirely different way, just because we would have different ways of resolving stuff, writing things out, pacing stuff, setting up the encounters, balancing stuff, whatever. It would just be that different, because it really comes down to the DM running this stuff. And especially when it comes to like how dice resolutions are handled, the difficulty DCs and what they actually mean, and how proficiencies are enforced and what they actually contribute. When you look at 5th edition, when you look at the pre-built adventures, like Lost Mines of Phandelver is that starter 5th edition that everybody kind of picks up. And, I read through most of that, and it was just like, it tells you what to describe here. It tells you what to describe there. It tells you how to do this, how to do that. But it doesn't really give you any of the actual reasoning or logic why. It, like, holds your hand walking you through the playground and doesn't actually tell you, like, why this is fun. Why you do this, why you get on this swing, why you go down this slide. It tells you this slide has 6 bolts in here, and they're made out of, like, stainless steel, and they have a hexagon nut, but then it doesn't, like, tell you why they're there or why they're holding it up. It's like, they're bare bones, except for the stuff that they do have is really, like, they just assume that you're a complete retard, but they don't give you the solutions to actually flex to something that might happen or whatever. And so each edition of it's going to be completely different just by extent of who's running it, because somebody has to fill in those holes, and the massive holes that the official content leaves behind. Everybody's going to have to come up with their own solutions to stuff, which is, fine. You can't really write out something that's going to cover every possible thing anyways. But, I extend that all the way to the whole rule set, where, like, I look at the rule set and it's like, yeah, this is a damn mess. I'm going to just take this as an idea, and then I'm just going to work around that idea and resolve things in completely different ways. And, like, everything that you're talking about is just like, yep, I'm already doing that. So beyond that, I don't really have too much comment, to be honest.
Sure, yeah.
I had the same experience with the Rime of the Frost Maiden campaign, where, like, supposedly the premise of the story is that this demigod has emerged that has the power to literally block out the sun over an entire, like, partial fucking continent. So, and then you're supposed to go into this where this expanse of, like, endless night and snow, and then believe that there are still just complete cities of people who are still operating and functioning like there's nothing wrong. So in my campaign, I made it so that the first town that the players went to, the people were leaving because they literally couldn't survive there. And the people who did stay were emaciated, and they would get together once a week to go to a food line, because the only spellcaster in the whole town was the mayor, and they spent all of their time casting create food spells to stock a warehouse with food for people to eat. Like, I actually tried to make it bleak to the point that, these people can't grow crops anymore. These people are doing everything they can to survive, and you're coming into this place, and you're going to have to survive just like them if you want to actually make it to the end.
Well, having actual, like, mechanics of the universe and of the game being leveraged to reinforce the setting and, like, the themes and stuff is definitely a pretty big deal. Veek, since you have to go soon, did you have any closing thoughts for us, or wrap-ups on the proficiency angle, or anything else we talked about?
So with proficiencies, I'm very not sure how it will gonna go. Ideally, it's very simple and very flexible, just like the text prompt system. But I don't really know. I think a lot of that will just come out when we actually do start, like, making the climb and stuff. But I'm definitely very excited with experimenting with the text prompt system. I already had a few ideas, but there were a few more elaborate examples posted by Keyan and you and Mesk of what kind of like interactions you might want to do, and I'm very interested how that can be also like expressed through the system. But I don't know, I'm pretty excited to see how that client idea can work. Like,
Yeah,
I
well, the client
definitely-
thing is a bit awkward because it's going to be a while before we get to it, and it's like if we want to actually test out some of these ideas, we're going to have to do it in a lo-fi sort of rough cut way, right? Until the client is ready.
But one thing was, yeah, I'm definitely very. I'm probably way more optimistic than Mesk in terms of like how the sim turns will turn out. But yeah, we'll just.
Well, it just hasn't been attempted, right? So it's like a lot of like that could work. That could be interesting, and that could be neat or whatever, right? But not much in practice yet, right? Like Mess said, has to see it in motion, kind of deal. So
right, yeah. I think a lot of details will just naturally come out when we actually start. I'm not really worried. I didn't really tend to do top-down design. That's just something I learned in programming because usually that just leads you astray to some things that like add up if you have just done the thing. But obviously in this case it's kind of hard to just do the thing because we don't have the client. I don't know. Would it be nice to do some progress on it?
Yeah.
I will think about it.
Okay. Well,
but yeah.
That sounds like that's it. Yeah. All right, man. Thanks for popping in for the time you had, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Have fun.
See you, Vic.
So, Keyan, back to you.
Yes.
Then. I do think it'll be important to have like a specific list of a bunch of things like proficiencies or whatever that, Mesk was talking about. There's nothing listed as like an explicit thing. It's just like an example or an idea. So it's not very in-depth yet, right? A lot of this stuff, as I describe, is just sort of like train of thought or whatever, it's just scribbles, it's scrap notes and stuff. And we can expand upon it later on as far as the documentation on the website goes. But I wanted to know if there was something in particular with relation to character progression that you think is like missing from 5th edition or could be better, that you would see an opportunity to exist within this setting or within this tabletop system as far as you understand it. Is anything coming to mind as like, this is always just kind of boring or lame? Like one of the things that I remember us discussing was classes, but it sounds like you already had an example in mind.
Yeah, that's a big thing that I don't like about 5th edition is that it's hard to like create new combinations of things for your character to do that are interesting and to like explain and also to role play. Like I'm playing I'm in a campaign right now where I'm playing a Goliath who is he is a cleric of the war god, and I wanted to create this like persona of like this as this big hulking guy, but like he's not very smart. He's not even necessarily a good cleric, but because he is such a good warrior and that's all he focuses on and that's his discipline, he gains the favor of the war god by executing battle well and having like prowess. And to do that, like I have to skip out on my ability score improvements so that I can take features that let me do interesting things with my spells. Like, for example, when I get my next level up in the campaign, I'm going to take there's a feature you can take that gives you a class feature of the sorcerer, which is that you have sorcery points. And you can spend sorcery points to do different things. And one of the things you can spend them on is to quicken a spell. And that basically means you can cast it as a bonus action instead of an action, and then you can still take your action to do something else. And that was so I could have these like a situation where like I'm up against another warrior and I get like critically wounded or something, and now I can roleplay like getting up, bowing up at that warrior, and then using my bonus action to cast a really powerful heal spell on myself and just like fucking grunting at him as my wounds close and intimidate him, and then swing at him with my weapon.
Right.
Whereas normally, all of that is an action. I can't. It's like I have to facilitate the things that I want to describe using the game mechanics, and that's kind of annoying because it would be nice if you could get features like that as part of customizing your character without having to sacrifice the actual being able to improve the things your characters can do.
I really like the idea of a feat that makes all vocal components of spells loud grunts.
Yeah, same.
I like that idea.
Well, it would give you the opportunity to say a lot of interesting, or make a lot of interesting noises while you're trying to cast your spells. But honestly, like the idea that I almost kind of feel like we go back to the proficiency system for a second. Like one of the things that combined with the like intimidation tactic idea that Keyan was talking about works together with is I feel like you could easily get to a point where you're like pretty skilled at intimidating things, and that like, some things might just not be intimidated, but or it may take more effort to intimidate them. But for the things that are like, the rabble or whatever, you could just force them to like run away by virtue of being as powerful as you are, obviously so with your level of power that's presented. So the place I'm going with this is the concept of being able to just say, hey, like this shit is, beneath me to some degree. I'm gonna, show this guy that he should have respected me, should have feared me or whatever, by demonstrating my capabilities, and like that being something that is part of your character, the way that Keyan is talking about. Like, I'm not sure how that would be grounded or like what we would say about that. Like, would you call that a proficiency in intimidation? Would you call that like, just a trait that you have?
Proficiency in grunting. It doesn't need to be anything more.
I guess you can get better at grunting by continuing to grunt. Skyrim style.
Exactly.
It helps too when you're able to like use the context of a situation to decide whether or not something works.
Yeah.
And that doesn't always work, but if you're like the case of the ogre that we discussed earlier, if the ogre walks up to like a 5-foot tall fucking farmer and he just looks down at him threateningly, that guy should be afraid unless he has a death wish or something. It shouldn't even be a check. Yeah.
You shouldn't need to like roll to strike fear into the farmer's mind or whatever. So I guess when we think about it in those terms, like, so there's a temptation I have to like maybe over legislate everything and define everything as a game mechanic instead of like it being sort of errata. And I feel like I'm never going to catch everything because the whole point is that you can't catch everything because it's like, the role playing part makes it non-deterministic. It's like a collaboration between two people or groups of people or whatever. So that is automatically going to set the bar in a very different location. So you can't catch everything in a game engine style or whatever. But I think what we could do is, again, we could basically have it be interpretive or whatever, where like I can add statuses to enemies based on the character's action. Like if I have to add an intimidated or feared status or whatever, like that's something that I can do as a result of something, right? So like if you're fighting a cowardly group of units, like, okay, when you kill one of them or brutally maim one of them, maybe the way that you actually kill them, like if you just kill them passively or whatever, and it's like more of a struggle, they might believe that they can, still defeat you despite the loss. But if you like, cleave them in half or something, just something that's really brutal, then maybe that's like another way that it can apply fear in that sense. And that doesn't have to be like a trait or something that's written somewhere as a mechanic. It's just like, well, this kind of makes sense. There's a danger to doing that, which means is that it could feel like something is just being pulled out of the game master's ass, and it's not really very satisfying or interesting. But
I do have an example of this. There's a popular phrase in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's, "How do you want to do this?" And it's what the dungeon master asks you when you reduce a creature's hit points to 0.
Okay.
And depending on how you describe how you would like to execute a creature, the dungeon master may decide just that, which is like if you're fighting a bunch of kobolds or something, and you just walk up to one of them and fucking eviscerate it and cut it into like 20 different pieces and it just slops all over the floor, like anime, then the other ones are probably going to run away.
Right. Yeah, well, that would make sense too. So I think when I consider how the system could work or whatever, when I consider how like that kind of action could be taken and how it could be resolved, it's exciting to think that it could be a scaling thing as well. The way that Mesk was talking about his scaling checks and his scaling saves is like there could actually be different results or different degrees of efficacy of a certain action or a certain subtext. And like, yeah, you, like Keyan was saying earlier, you probably shouldn't need to like spend an action to, try to intimidate somebody additionally. Like it should probably just be the way that you role play your execution or your attack or whatever you're doing in addition to, like, it doesn't actually take extra, like that much extra concentration to like bellow out a war cry while you're, healing yourself up and closing your wounds or whatever, like that really shouldn't require you to spend an extra additional action. And that, but if you role play that way, like that's sort of what we're getting at is like, can you get into character and do something extra with your role playing prowess that allows you to like maybe intimidate enemies in a way that can't, like, it's not a conventional written rule or whatever, you know what I mean?
Well, in this, the NPC rolls his tailoring magic so high, he creates a new sock out of ambient hair.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, or an example I was going to use earlier that I forgot would be like, if you were an absolute master with smith's tools, you could be like the fucking dwarf from God of War, where you just take something and you tap it once with your ball peen hammer, and now it's a fucking like enchanted +3 weapon.
Very reasonable. What is I don't.
There is actually an NPC that can do that in SS. Not quite tap it, but close.
Like, that's the whole idea for me is like, what can we do to make the game more about role playing and less about like binary stat checks, I guess. And initially, proficiencies might seem like they're binary stat checks the way that I'm describing them, or it's not really a stat check, but it's a binary check. Is like, can you do this action? Well, only if you're proficient enough. But I think it's more like you get more role playing opportunities, and on top of it, again, like there could be gradations of efficacy. It could be like, here's my hacker who's only level 2 at hacking, and so he's going to open the door for us, but it will trigger the alarm. Whereas like if you have a level 3 hacker or something like that can do more than that, maybe you can stealthily do it, or maybe you can disable the alarm first and it'll just take longer. Whereas like the other guy can't do that. Like that's a case where, okay, now we're getting into territory where we're like, we can still do actions, it just might not be as effective. And the other thing, of course, too, being like, if you're something I was talking about with Keyan when I was actually drafting the system in my mind is you don't want actions that are enabled by high level proficiencies to always be the best course of action, like 100% of the time. And that will help make it feel less binary as well. Like, okay, I'm a proficiency level 3 marksman, but that doesn't mean that I can always pick the same point on a hard point on a unit that I can now attack and have it be more effective, like, or the most effective thing, because then it's just removing the choice and it's no longer about role playing.
It's important that the features that are available to your character actually scale just as well as their like basic attack does, because there's in the first campaign of Critical Role, the person who is playing a ranger, like there were multiple times throughout the campaign where they would try to cast a spell that was supposed to be like a good spell for their character. It'd take their whole action and it would do like 1/10 of the damage that they would have done if they had just attacked 3 times with their basic attack. And you just see them like, they just absolutely lose their shit over it because they wasted their whole turn doing that.
That's a very common problem. It's one of the things that make, like, half of the features and shit you get in any of the multi-classes that let you have basic attacks are worthless. Like, if you have something that lets you cast a cantrip upon making a melee attack or whatever, why would you ever use this instead of extra attack or a bonus attack? Like, and get a double melee attack, because both of them are still going to be attack checks, but one of them has a modifier and higher weapon damage. And if you have magical weapons, even more so. Not to mention the cantrips really don't scale that well later on. And you throw in something like marksman or power attack on top of it, and it's pretty much always efficient to use it once you have it. You're not going to run into too many games like mine where the AC variables can be really high. It's basically you are just always going to use this now that you have it, because that -5 to attack in the long run is not going to make a big difference. And you can just use power attack every single attack. And it's like that one hit is an extra 10 flat damage, and 10 flat damage is king. Like, you have an enormous amount of reliability in that. And then if you throw into things like favored enemy, your modifier, anything else that increases that, you can enter circumstances like in SS, where I mentioned before, someone dual wielding hand crossbows with marksman. That's like 19 flat damage or something a hit. Like, the weapon damage at that point doesn't even matter. Like, a crit is worthless. Just, it's a guaranteed hit. That's the only part of it that even matters. Except for the special ammunition I added, that I add dice onto weapon up enhancements, not flat modifiers. So that crit, threat, and stuff like that, and advantages, stuff like that, is more valuable than just, oh, you hit and dealt extra flat damage. The way that items are normally designed in D&D is absolutely mind-blowingly stupid. It's like, here is your epic enhanced sword of magical death and destruction, holy hell hope, and it does like +2 damage and +2 attack modifier. It's really boring. So I add a lot of stuff onto them.
Sorry, not to interrupt you.
It's fine.
Not just items, though, like subclasses, too. There are subclasses that are just super static and completely aloof from the thing that they try to portray in their description. And An example of this is the Evocation Wizard. I hated it so much, I rewrote it. For the Evocation Wizard at 5th level, I think, you get something called Potent Cantrip, which is supposed to increase the damage of your cantrips, but it's only for cantrips that have saving throws, and the wizard doesn't use cantrips that have saving throws. So it's literally fucking useless. You get a class feature that does nothing for you.
Yeah.
Well, the masterminds behind Wizards of the Coast apparently thought they knew what to do about that one. Jesus.
The casters, especially in 5th edition, are an afterthought at best. Like, one of these days, you should go to 5e tools, start at level 1 spells, and go down to level 9, and just, you don't even need to know the real context of the game, just the spell descriptions of what they do, because you hit a break point about midway through where they just clearly stop giving a shit at all. You run into stuff like Gis and Magic Jar even fairly early on that are basically save or dies, and then you of course enter the later ones like Wish, and even Ray of Disintegration is really stupid because of the way indestructibility and destroying indestructibility is written in D&D, and there really is like not really much of the flavor thing. Is like becoming a lich, for example, is something you have to entirely homebrew, whereas as far as I'm aware in Pathfinder, there is actually classes built around that entire concept, and their class features and stuff like that are all related to making that progression. And
Go ahead.
And like the spell, especially when you get to casters versus marshals, is like Luller Skates was showing me a couple of days ago. When you hit the 20th level for some classes, and then you look between the spell balance between them, the fighter gets like an extra attack, and meanwhile wizards literally change the entire world with a spell cast and just erase people out of existence forever. And then you have paladins, where their idea of trying to make them more balanced was to basically give them the resistance to all damage. And then like the entire magic damage system is just pants on head retarded, and banish is stupid, and this. There's a reason why a lot of people try to stick to low level adventures, and I bet you there's only a handful of people that even brave the levels that Autumn Wind went into. And it was my luck that it was a very physical dominant party, because if it was a spellcaster heavy party, I basically had to errata every single thing.
Yeah.
Because it's busted as all fuck and incomprehensible. There's a lot of them that are just flat out useless, and there's a lot of them that you don't think are really that broken, but actually are, like a great feast that gives you like 8 hours or something of immunity to poison. No, maybe advantage. I can't remember the exact. Let me dig that up. But it was something I brought into. I don't think it had an effect because it was just a one shot. But it was a spell that you would use at the end of the last day, so it was effectively free. And connection timed out. Sure thing, my man. And so the next day, you just gained all of these insane... I don't care. Like, what the fuck?
The internet.
Heroes Feast, that's what it's called. So, let me just... Okay, Reddit. You bring forth a great feast. Yada, yada, yada. A creature that partakes of the feast gains several benefits. It is immune to poison and frightened. Makes all wisdom save throws with advantage. Hit point maximum increases by 2d10. Gains that maximum number, so it heals. It lasts for 24 hours. Use it. This conjures food. It's like conjure food that Keyan mentioned earlier on crack. And when you have 6 level spells, the materials are just nothing. And you just cast that, and the next day you are just now immune to a bunch of status effects. Make one of the most important mental saves in the game with advantage, and just gain some free health on top of it, because sure. And you get that for all the next day, so as long as you keep that one spell slot free, and, you know, your rich ass carries around a couple gems, you can just keep casting at the end of every day and have these insane benefits for the next day. And it's just like... You take a bunch of stuff, like fear becomes very common in monster stat blocks after a point, because all the monster stat blocks after like level 5 or 6 are pretty much the same thing. They just put it on an Excel sheet and ramped up the stats as you went up until like I think about CR15 you start seeing arbitrary spell reflex or immune to spell ranges. And a lot of it just has fear and swallow and devour, which just is like, oh, I hit you. I guess that now you're restrained inside of me for now. And Vor Fetish, I guess. You know, maybe Wizards of the Coast post on Reddit. And fear and poison just suddenly cease to exist when you have access to this spell. So, like, that's not one. Like, when you normally think about spellcasters being mind-blowingly busted, you think about things like Charm and, you know, maybe damage spells like Meteor Shower or whatever. But you don't really think about the utility spells. But a lot of the utility spells are also very busted and just not well thought out. Like, why should you arbitrarily become immune to all these status effects? How do you remove this? You don't. By the way, it cures all diseases and poison too. So there are some pretty nasty diseases. And you may have some custom ones, and they just are arbitrarily removed when you eat this. So
it turns into like hunt down the guy who can cast this spell to cure all maladies, even if it's not one of our party members.
Cleric or druids, and then Divine Soul Sorcerer. And bards are very broken. Bards are one of the most insane classes of the game, because they normally, like Keyan was saying, classes have like certain schools of magic, whatever, that they have access to.
Yeah.
And that can be really restrictive. I mentioned Eldritch Knight before, having basically access to only utility spells. Well, bards can just get these features that just let them have access to basically any spell they want in the game, no matter what it is.
Oh,
and
okay.
Yeah, they also gain expertise, which allows you to double your proficiency bonus on certain things. So in Autumn Winds, we had a grappler that had expertise athletics, and that allowed... I can't remember what his highest rolls were. I can try to pull it up here. I know it was probably 15 or 16, I think. So he would make advantage checks with 15 or 16. He could also use Restraining Strike. The difference between grapple and Restraining Strike is grapple doesn't give you any advantages once you have them grappled. You can stop them from moving, and that's about it. Restraining Strike, everything, anything within, like, I think 5 feet has advantage on them. So It's normally something that only creatures get, but with a combat maneuver, you can get Restraining Strike. It might have been unearthed, I don't really remember, but it's... So the other thing about that is that I believe it added to your check as well. So I think his... I don't remember. There was some roll, like his average dice roll for grappling was like in the 30s. So conventional creatures are never going to be able to avoid getting grappled by him. And he also got enlarged self. So for the creatures that were conventionally generally too large to be grappled, he could just make himself larger and just grapple them.
Yeah.
And like there are cases, because there's no rules to deal with this, that you shouldn't be able to grapple certain things because the torque that certain things have would mean that you can't control their movement, right? Like a guy on a huge horse. You might be large, but have fun trying to push this massive, like supernatural horse. Have fun trying to stop like a tank. Like there's things that are not very fast. They just have a lot of torque and a lot of weight. Like how do you control these things? And then we get into the subject of weights. So there's like there's just so much stupid shit.
Yeah.
One of the most dangerous areas in all of Autumn Winds was an area called Alfanir that was inside this giant frozen cavern, completely abandoned by light, practically exposed to vacuum. If you were outside light sources, you would go mad within like seconds, and you would freeze to death about as fast. So navigating it was supposed to be really difficult, going across these chains in this abyss, where if you fall down there, it's pretty much instant death. But it turns out that lower cases summon creatures can summon something that's basically like a giant vulture. When a creature's size is large, it just gains a massive amount of arbitrary carry capacity. Which means that this bird can now carry someone who's carrying like 300 pounds of gear in the person.
Great.
And there's nothing that says they move at half speed or whatever while they're doing this. So they just casually flew across the cavern. And bypassed everything. Completely.
Because why wouldn't they?
Yeah, so that was unexpected. I didn't realize that. And like the carry capacity, because normally there is a strength-related carry capacity, and we were enforcing something similar to that. But just by extent of being larger, you just gained an enormous amount. Which is really funny because there are, like, I believe that Goliath is one of them, that has a feature called Large Build or something like that, where they have an amount of increased carry capacity. And that's like one of their defining things. But then large creatures just kind of like bypass the entire system. Now, creatures don't have weight values. So if you encounter circumstances where you're trying to move weight around, you just have to kind of bullshit your way through that too. So this is a case where you would definitely want to be looking at like having proficiency / attribute resolutions that have a system governed that is outside of dice completely. Like you're talking about being kind of worried about having too much governance built into the game mechanics. But what you need, like, you definitely can't account for everything. Like,
Yeah.
I had no idea that this was going to happen. He had summoned creatures, but never did I imagine, because it was too stupid and too far in the future, that he could make a large animal that could actually carry people of this weight. And, you know, until then, we had the grappler would cast enlarge so that he could carry a brazier with him for a while. But I mean, that only lasts a short amount of time. And he can't fly anyway, so whatever. But then they had a goddess with them who just carried the brazier for them instead. But she wasn't going to carry it across the chasm because it was too dangerous. Turns out they didn't need it anyways because they could just fly. So you need, when you're building these systems, you need to have something that establishes consistency. And then that consistency is something you can reflect upon for systems that are unexpected. Like, with large creatures, just because a bird becomes large doesn't necessarily mean that a bird can suddenly carry hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Because birds are very light. Wings are only capable of so much. So on, you know, you got to think about things like aerodynamics. You got to think about the environment. None of this stuff is established in the rules. There is no precedent to go off for really any of this. You know, there was a part where they're falling off of a ledge, and they're basically falling into an event horizon. And one player is like, I could possibly jump after this guy, grab him, teleport, and save him from falling. And I know that the fall of no return is like 100 feet. But at about 60 feet, you can't see them anyways. Now the thing, how fast do you fall in a round? So now I have to look up on the internet.
Yeah.
I have to look up on the internet
Okay.
and see how other people ruled that, because there is no actual rules that I know of for that. And some people are like, oh, like 100 or 80 feet a foot or something, a second or something like that, or 6 seconds. Because a round is 6 seconds.
Right, yeah.
Which, by the way, has its own complications. And so then I have to say, well, it's been like, I think it was 2 rounds and he's long gone. So it's, like too many times you have to go out of the game to find answers that should be in the game. Because there is no precedent to go off of for things like falling speed is kind of a big one. Like rules is written, you just kind of hit the ground. I had a unit fall like 400 feet, and it was like 1d6 damage for every like 10 feet or something. So I just rolled like 400 d6. And it all happens in one round because at that point I didn't have any rulings. So I didn't want to go looking for it because it wasn't going to matter.
Yeah.
And what about a unit that is immune to physical damage? Falling would be bludgeoning damage, right? Do you just like hit terminal velocity, hit the ground, and just like stand back up again? Like, how do you rule this? Like, now I have to think about, so is there something inside of it that would take damage? Like, if they're immune to physical damage, does the kinetic forces amount to force damage? Like, what is force damage? Is just magic damage. Now you start asking all these stupid questions that should be like right at the forefront.
It doesn't help that you have like feather fall, and then you have characters who have slow fall as a feature, and then you have creatures who have slow fall as a feature. And it just like arbitrarily reduces their fall damage.
Let's talk about game balance for a moment. So I wanted to talk to you about CR quarter creatures here. Keyan's going to love this. I hope he's run into this and he knows precisely where I'm going with it, because I think it's really fucking stupid. So there is, let's go to creatures. There's a creature I'd like to tell you about called the Giant Owl. I think it's the Giant Owl. And it is one of the most powerful creatures in the game. Okay, let me see if I can find it here.
I'm guessing it does some really stupid things.
Yes, it's ridiculous. Okay, so Giant Owl, challenge 1/4. So it's 1/4. So the way challenge rating is supposed to be statted out is a challenge rating 1 creature should be threatening to a party of level 1s, so 4 level 1s. Challenge rating is a bullshit system for a variety of reasons, dice being in the forefront, but let's just go with the rules as written. A level 1 character typically has sub 10 health. They might have they might have studded leather if you rolled for gold and you dumped a lot into it. But they were only one. Studded leather and a martial weapon like a rapier is kind of like your target as a level 1 character that uses light armor. But they're both pretty expensive, and unless you're rolling for gold and get really lucky, you're probably not going to get it. Sometimes you can game your background or stuff like that. I think DMs normally do not let you get gold from your background if you roll for your gold. It's one or the other. The amount of gold you do get depends on your class. So if you're like a barbarian, you just kind of get shafted, but you don't need armor anyway, so you're just usually aiming for a weapon. But typically speaking, stuff like full plate mail, 18 AC, that's expensive, well beyond. That's why you can't recover armor off of enemies.
Yeah.
Because you might kill a guard with full plate mail and suddenly have a 1400 gold armor at level 1. You never know.
Yeah, it's just stupid.
So a challenge rating quarter, 1/4, is 4 of these would be threatening to a level 1 party. Now, the Giant Owl is a very interesting creature because when we look at its stats, it has an average hit points of 19, which is quite high because let's say you did get that rapier at level 1. Let's say you're a rogue or a fighter with a rapier and the rapier does 1d8 damage. You might, depending on your allocation, have a +3 damage modifier. So your average hit, if you landed maximum dice, will deal like 12, 13 damage at the absolute highest. Like if you got god tier rolls. Otherwise, you're going to be doing maybe 10 damage if you're very lucky. But chances are your average is going to be more like 5 or 6 damage. And that's if you can hit them. So 19 health means you need several consecutive hits to hit this creature. The average movement speed is 30 feet, right? If you use dash, again, that uses your action, that's 60 feet. When you're up against creatures at low level, the game is extraordinarily lethal. Because a lot of enemies in the monster manual, they don't have to make checks. You don't have to make checks for something to happen to you. Wolves, if they get a hold of you, they just instantly knock you down. Or they grab a hold of you, or whatever. There's a lot of things that they restrain you on hit, no check associated. A lot of things can even stun you on hit, or paralyze you on hit, no check associated. There's other things with other creatures that like the giant owl in particular, because the giant owl is very tanky. It has a +2 dexterity modifier, so its saves are pretty reasonable. By the way, it flies at 60 feet because all flying creatures have insanely high movement speed. The other interesting thing about it is that it has something called flyby, in that it ignores all attacks of opportunity.
Wow.
So it can fly in and fly out.
Yeah.
And depending on the positioning in the map terrain, it can be well outside of any range of any melee character after having attacked you. If the owl uses dash, that's 120 movement. The owl has a +3 to hit and deals 2d6 +1. That's as much damage as a greatsword. That's an average of 8 damage, which for any like non-physical character is going to instantly down them if it hits it for 8 damage. And that's on a creature that is constituted is that their challenge rating says this is as powerful as one character, but it has an average of twice, if not more, of the health. Its hit points is 3d10 +3. It deals as much damage as a greatsword, and it ignores attacks of opportunity and moves twice as fast. Oh, and it's flying. So I mean, if the DM wants to, they can be real assholes with these units. They can come in from the sides on an ambush, and because it has a stealth +4, it actually has proficiency.
What the fuck? It's a
So
giant owl.
It can hide in the trees or something, and it's a large beast.
Yeah.
So remember how I talked about how large creatures can carry things? There is nothing that says this thing can't just grab you and drop you off of a cliff. It'll be like Dwarf Fortress and Giant Eagles grabbing people and dropping them off of cliffs. Nothing says it can't do this. And that's a CR 1/4. Like, if you encounter these creatures at level 1, you are going to have to hopefully be a ranged party that has some kind of jump on them, or you're just going to be fucking dead, unless the rolls go really well in your favor. Like, the game balance from there on only gets more and more and more fucked, where you have creatures of the same CR, particularly in lower levels, that are just disproportionately stronger than each other to the point of absurdity. And like I said, at later levels, it gets stupid. You would expect a high-level unit to have a very large, complicated stat block, because it's going to take a while to grind through his health, right? Like, he's going to be hard to fight. So surely he does interesting things. Okay, so the Tarasque. This is a CR 30. It's Monstrosity Titan. It's some giant, like, T-Rex thing. It has fairly high physical stats, no int, no charisma, -4 int, 0 dex. And it just has legendary save. It can automatically fail a save. It has advantage against all spells and other magic. Anytime it's targeted by a magic missile spell, lion spell, or a spell that requires a ranged attack roll a 1d6. It has a 1 to 5 chance out of 6 of not taking anything. And on 6, it's just a reflect. So it has advantage. And most of the targeted spells, it just outright is immune to, if not reflects it to you. Does double damage to structures. Okay, sure thing. All of its attacks are just basically roll damage, roll attacks and hit, +19. Has an auto restrain, and there is a save related to a knockdown. It has a frightful aura. You may remember this from back in Neverwinter Nights, where like half the units later on in the game have this aura that you enter it, you just have to run away automatically. You lose all control of your character and you're just being attacked relentlessly, kind of like that. Just 5th edition fear. And then the Swallow, where you hit something and it just automatically devours them and starts dealing damage. Unless they get hit with enough damage and it provokes a con save that they might vomit them out. Pretty much every creature after a certain CR has this. And then legendary actions, which is another actually very hotly contested thing. So even when you have a creature like that, that's all it has, by the way. It's just roll to attack. If you hit, you deal damage. Sometimes knock them down, restrain them, or eat them. That's it. For the highest CR in the game.
Yeah.
The most sophisticated, most powerful thing on this list in terms of combat rating, that's literally all it does. It's just, look, I hit things and I have high numbers, and if you're near me, you get frightened. And that's it. And also I reflect spells because that's cool. Our casters are dumb, so let's balance them by making things arbitrarily immune to them. Neat. Very neat.
Very neat. And now we have legendary actions. So, legendary actions, you enter a case with this action economy business where you might have a creature like the Terrascue that has these stupidly high stats and an insane amount of health. But if there's like 5-6 turns worth of shit before they get a chance to do anything, they can still enter a case where they can't actually do anything. That's why we have legendary resistance, where if they fail a saving throw, they can just succeed it instead. Because there are so many spells that if you get hit by them, you're crippled. You're dead. There's Hold Monster, for example, that if this creature wasn't already immune to... I mean, this says an attack roll. I think Hold Monster still works on it. Hold Monster is quite easy to get, especially when we're talking at high-level spells. If you get hit by Hold Person, Hold Monster, you are now stunned. Anything that hits you within 5 feet is an automatic critical hit. So even though this creature has an average of, close to 700 health, okay, sure. But if you're held, every single hit on you is a crit. At this CR, you're looking at units with 3 times extra attack, 2 times extra attack, and then extra bonuses. The amount of damage, even with conventional weapons, is going to start adding up. Its damage immunities is to, like, half the shit in the game except for non-magical attacks. Well, after a certain point, everything is a magical attack anyway, so it doesn't matter. And this is immune to being paralyzed, but a lot of things are not immune to being paralyzed. Like, that's what you have to do, is you have to arbitrarily make them immune to stuff if you don't want Hold Monster and stuff like that to arbitrarily influence them. Well, okay, let's say that you can't use Hold Monster. You still have Ray of Enfeeblement. You still have, certain kinds of poisons. In one of the one-shots that I played, a monk, one of our party members was a monk. He applied poison to his hands and his knees because you can do that. There's nothing that says you can't. Whenever he hits someone with that, he provokes these poisons. And these poisons, nullify the ability to, cast spells, or they invoke me. I can't remember what they did, but they were blowing legendary saves every single time he hit the enemy boss, the final boss, because if he did not blow a legendary save on it, he would be dead, because it completely cripples his abilities. So that's one interaction that's really stupid. And it feels bad, too, because if you enter a party that doesn't actually have a lot of these resources, then legendary saves scale disproportionately against them, where the few successes they might have get nullified instantly by having legendary resistance. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Welcome back.
Legendary actions are similarly dumb because basically the creature only gets its one turn, but it needs to do something if it's being swarmed by you can have groups of 7, 8, 9 people. There was a story of a CR-15 being swarmed by 7 or 8 level 1s or 2s and being killed just because of action coming, LMAO. And legendary actions is the answer to that, where at the end of a creature's turn, it can use something. It can do something like attack. Sometimes it can move half their movement speed in the case of this unit. And, Terrascue makes 1 bite or attack or use or swallow. Maybe that uses 2 actions in the case of this. So at the end of your turn, an enemy might just suddenly decide to do something. And that can be really unexpected. And yeah, so this kind of became a little bit contested on a wind, where Lolor's case was telling me that, or maybe it wasn't Lolor, maybe it was HKS was telling me that legendary actions are kind of dumb because the whole point of having non-simultaneous turns is to bias into planning to an extent.
Yes.
And also to award good initiative rolls and stuff like that. And it adds structure to the fight where we avoid things like those mutually exclusive stuff I talked about earlier. Legendary actions really fuck with that because after your turn, a unit can just move or do something. And what I ended up started doing, what I did with the final major fight of Autumn Wind, is I rolled separate initiatives. Well, rather, I rolled 1 initiative and I split it up. And I do have the writing for that somewhere here, I believe. And I felt that was way more healthy, as if I wanted a unit to have multiple turns, I would actually give it multiple turns and separate them amongst the other units according to what they rolled. So that, for 1, it didn't have all of its turns lopped up inside of each other. For 2, that I may never have written this down in the stat block. It may actually be on the game. For 2, it has multiple chances to do something, and then I actually balance this action economy out based on those turns.
That actually
So-
very much reminds me of what Heroes 5 did with Initiative, by the way.
Which was
That's exactly what you just mentioned. The like a unit would be able to do multiple actions during like other people's few turns, but it would basically be displaced in time, so it wouldn't be stuck. It's basically identical to what you're describing.
well, the thing
Yeah.
that the legendary action system seems to do is just break the entire system that they put together, which is exactly like all of the anti-magic resistances just existing as a way to balance, in air quotes, the fact that wizards and sorcerers are broken at later levels. It's like, well, instead of fixing these core problems that we observe with our game, we're just gonna like bandage fix them with like systems that work like against the core principle of the whole like not simultaneous turn approach, right? Like individual turns are meant to be played in sequence. So now let's invent a system that like inverts that so that we can get around people who are maximizing initiative stat or whatever, you know what I mean?
So this is kind of wordy, so I'm not going to summarize in this. I'm just going to post the image. But this is the written out version of what I ended up doing at the end of Autumn Wind, which is probably what I'm going to do for major encounters that are too major to balance around legendary actions that are unpredictable. And also because legendary actions feel really imbalanced when you're actually using them.
Yeah.
Because I can write out legendary actions, and I usually try to split power budget amongst legendary actions. Like if a unit has a bunch of strong attacks, it can only do like it spreads them out across the round basically instead of having them all lumped up into one thing. But when you do that by legendary actions, nobody can plan around it. And to me, that always just felt wrong. So I did this all on the fly. I had considered it, but I decided to do it all on the fly with Autumn Wind's Final Fight, where I just split all of its attacks amongst this broad form initiative. And I only like semi-recently wrote it out for SS, so that the idea was just like, yeah, you guys can now see what I'm going to do. We had a discussion earlier about, what do you choose to reveal to the players?
Yes.
Well, game mechanical stuff like this is one major thing I reveal when either it's been used or it's about to be used that people need to be aware of why I'm doing stuff. So if they have a question, I can just say, okay, look at this. So that's why I wrote this out. So it's just like one of those things where like I want to establish a degree of consistency. And that degree of consistency is for all these major fights, I'm going to be moving away from legendary actions completely and moving to the broad form initiative that will also then scale more appropriately with the party size. Like if you engage with like 10 NPCs, then they might have more broad form initiative roles or more places in the initiative, and then they might have less in other cases. And we also have it set up in the way where there isn't back-to-back turns as well. So it's just a way to set things out in a way where it's just like there won't be like uncertainty about stuff. You know how things are. Maybe you push things more into a gamey sense and away from what some might construe as a spirit of role playing because things become more predictable. But when it comes to combat in particular, where you are interacting with game systems already to some extent, dice and all, having things be completely unknown like that, other than like what enemies are capable of, there is always, to some extent, some amount of information gathering you can do. But in terms of when they're going to make a turn altogether, that stuff is something I feel should be more exposed and readily apparent. So it's definitely irrelevant to what you guys are doing because the simultaneous turns really eliminates this completely. But this is one of the things I've done with 5th edition to try to break away from the mold of the very bland and also very volatile monster manual stuff that they ship with.
No, that whole stuff is just a prank. I think it's definitely better to have your own creatures and your own systems for what clearly doesn't work, which is a shame because, like, it would be nice to not have to reinvent the wheel all the time whenever I want to do something. But, like, clearly the default experience is not up to par. I'm sure it could still be, engaging and enjoyable with friends, but there's just so many things that, like, whittle down the experience and water it down as well. It feels like, well, I was going to have a lot of, fun really trying to express like what this character is all about and like really trying to embody the character in writing. That's what role playing is about essentially. And But instead, I have to like deal with the fact that dice rolls made me fumble, even though I'm a veteran warrior or something. You know what I mean? It's like this shit just doesn't work. It like clearly doesn't work. So I obviously was something I said while you were reviewing Mesk was we do need to spend a decent amount of time like nailing down certain things, like the proficiencies you were saying. There's not really any listed because it's just like a scribble note right now as to like how we want to handle it. So it would be nice if we had something more explicit. But that's where I get into like how much do I want to nail down every single detail, or how is it even like how possible is it even to nail down like every single potential thing you could be proficient in? Because like ultimately it's where do you like broadly categorize every action more or less, and into what discipline do you categorize actions and things that you can do in the world? And then, there's also like now we're talking about proficiencies affecting combat, whereas it sounds like in 5th edition they were mostly about, I'm sure there were some that affected combat, but it sounds like they were mostly about non-combat things like, lockpicking or whatever. In this world, we're talking about like, no, everything. There's like everything that you do can be governed or attenuated by proficiency. And, that's where we get into like equipment. Like maybe you do get this targeting HUD that like, helps you aim better or something. So it gives you like a flat +1 to that proficiency or something to that effect, right? You could imagine something like that that could work out well. But beyond all that, I guess we're sort of coming to the point where we can talk about a final topic. And for my final topic, unless anybody else has things to say about...
I did want to add in one more quick story, because I was really surprised that Mesk didn't mention this when he was talking about the quarter CR creatures.
Yeah.
To completely break the game, you only need to be a 7th level druid. At 4th level, you take the Warcaster feat so that you have concentration on checks to maintain your concentration spells. You have advantage on those checks. And then you can have a 3rd level spell called Conjure Animals. And it's a 3rd level spell. And you can cast it to summon 8 creatures of a quarter CR, and for every 2 levels that you upcast it, you double the number of creatures that you summon. So, and you take the Circle of the Shepherd subclass as the Druid, which at 6th level makes it so that all of the creatures that you summon have bonus hit points and their attacks become magical. So you then summon 16 velociraptors, which have each velociraptor has 2 attacks, and it has a feature called Pack Tactics, where if it's flanking enemies, it gets advantage on its attacks. So you just summon 16 velociraptors, completely surround every enemy on the battlefield, and your party just sits back and does nothing while you win.
I did not know about the druid build, but I've had people summoning raptors in my games, that's for sure.
How is
I actually randomized the summons they got, so we didn't quite hit that level. But you can summon the creatures that have on-hit restraints too. So it's not just like the raptors or whatever. You can just summon something that gives you an on-hit restrain, and then
and then
you restrain them, and your party just blows them up.
That druid subclass also has it can summon like a totem, and one of the totems gives everything in a certain radius advantage on strength checks. So you just summon something that's good with strength, with like grappling, and then it just has advantage the whole time.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so busted. No, I did not know about druids actually. I haven't really looked at druids too much, but that's just. I know Lower Skates is gonna have ideas now.
Yep.
You get just really insane shit with druids.
Dumb.
But yeah. So anyway, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was only bringing that up because transitioning into this final topic here, I wanted to talk a little bit about character progression in general, but I also wanted to talk about mechanics for like, there's this long rest, short rest stuff, right? And I don't know how to feel about all of that. I feel like maybe it's just contextual on the role-playing side, but I think it's a little bit weird that you have spell slots at all, as an example of like, I can only cast Fireball once a day, or, whatever the case may be, right? And that is something that I just don't know how to like work through that. Like for me, I would think of it more like, you have these innate abilities, and like how can they be handled? How can they be taken care of? Like, how can you use them?
Do you think we would have like ammo restocking? That's like sort of similar, but sci-fi, more sci-fi.
Well, you're not going to magic it out in when you're sleeping, that's for sure. So you need to go find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there will be ammunition counts and stuff. So, like, that will be a thing. I mean, there is a question as to whether or not you'll ever run out of conventional munitions, or if you'll only have like special ammunition. That's something that Mesk was talking about earlier. It's like maybe you find some like limited but special ammunition as a resource that you can use to, like, you know, this attack now, you know, deals some incendiary damage or something, you know, whatever the case may be. But I think it would be fine to have like scavenging for weapons or whatever, and like trying to get ammo, or if it's a conventional thing. I think that could be interesting.
Do you guys think weapon durability makes sense in something like this, or?
I think it would be very cumbersome.
Yeah,
I don't think it would be too much fun.
In general, I feel like the durability side of things is kind of dumb. I can see where some people find value in it. Like, I was thinking maybe if you're like you're a rifleman, you're an aficionado, you're kind of like veteran in that space. Okay, you can like clean your gun and like take care of it and stuff or whatever. But like, it's not a very interesting way of expressing your identity as a character, because you're basically just like, oh, yeah, I don't have a chore, whereas the other characters that don't have this have a chore.
Like, the thing with durability is probably, like, forces players to experiment more with what they have, like, with limited resources, and if you don't have durability, you can just use one weapon and stick to it. Maybe
well, that's where I think ammunition or some sort of, like, limited resource would be a better and more organic system for durability, because you can scavenge to find more ammo. You can't really scavenge to find, like, durability improve. I mean, maybe it depends on how the system is articulated, but it just seems a bit weird.
Gear damage in 5th edition is really weird, because basically for a lot of things is that if you are holding something, it becomes arbitrarily immune to a lot of effects that would deal damage to stuff, or if you're wearing stuff, it becomes kind of like special needs, where you can set it on fire or whatever, but you can't really like destroy it in a lot of cases. And I kind of like hit that situation with like, because in SS, in like, say for example, our last fight, I had people getting hit with miniature stars that was just like instantly dropping them. There was just like localized supernovas exploding in people's faces. Like, it was dealing so much damage that it was almost overkilling them even from near full. And like, what happens to your clothing that you're wearing when you get hit by this? Like, normally, whatever you're wearing, you should be instantly destroyed by this as well. But, you know, in many cases, as rules are written, your gear is not destroyed when you're instantly down by whatever. Like, I would have to start making special cases, and now we start introducing a durability system, which is like, now people are going to be afraid to ever enter a fight, because this shit gets more common at this point where you're getting hit with massive weapons. And those massive weapons would be at least annihilating the effectiveness of your gear every single time you're hit with them. And then it feels like extra punishing to even fight anything at all. And then, you know, we enter these cases where, like, how do I roll it for NPCs or whatever, that a lot of them don't wear armor. They just have, like, natural protection. And then now do we have, like, what about the scales of a dragon? Does that also have durability? Like, when you start getting into these durability systems, you start opening all these cans of worms and Pandora's boxes, and you start asking all these questions. So it's something that, like, you should, like, I was talking earlier about, like, frostbites and weather and upkeep and water and stuff like that. And it's like, you need to ask, like, at what point do you want to granulate this down into a rule set? Because I think there is most certainly a crowd who would prefer that. There's a lot of people who prefer very, like, hard, raw, everything is down as a rule, everything is punishing. You know, one slight mishap, one wrong dice roll ends the game. There's definitely a crowd for that. Like, when I'm talking about stuff in the past, like the one-hit kill, aging stuff, and oxygen, and the fire elemental and stuff like that, there are people who like that. So you have to kind of, like, ask yourself, like, what kind of a game do I want to run, where I feel like things like durability and, you know, destroying everything that's on you when you get hit by a fireball and stuff like that, that's the stuff that I feel like is going to increase the health of the game, because there will be people who argue in favor of that. What kind of crowd do I want to target with this?
There's a good example of the durability thing being difficult to manage, and it's in the first Critical Role campaign, a character plays a gunslinger, and the fantasy of his character is that he's, like, actually the first person to invent firearms in the setting. And so, like the DM, he has to engineer them, he has to maintain them, he has to actually like go to a workshop that he stocks with stuff in order to even fix them. And when he uses them, if he rolls a 2 or a 3, they jam, and he has to spend time out of combat using like tools to unjam them. Or if he rolls a 1, they break. And then there was an encounter where he had like 3 different firearms, and he just rolled like 3 crit fails in a row, and all of his weapons busted, and then he was useless for the next like 4 hours of the session. And then he also had to spend like a lot of resources and gold on top of that just to fix them.
Yeah, that kind of like, oh, here's the dice roll absolutely ruining you is one of the main reasons I want to avoid dice rolls to begin with. But even beyond that, it's like you can remove the RNG part of it, but I can see where if there's just natural wear and tear buildup, or whatever I think it's. I mean, this sounds weird to say because obviously usually binary things aren't super healthy. But if your, gun gets hit by a fireball or something, like maybe there should be giblet rules where insta-gib rules basically is like...
Maybe your weapon would be debuffed or something?
Well, no, in this case, I'm thinking if it's a powerful enough attack, it just gets destroyed. And then you have to go find a different gun. Like it can be healthier or more sane if there's just more weapons lying around. And like if you get attached to like a piece of gear because of you've worked to improve it and enchant it, then maybe there's like a way to recover it or something with more
I definitely
resources.
like a direction where you are prompted to experiment more, but you are also not forced to it too much. And I feel like a durability system would force you. And usually I wouldn't even consider a durability system, but since we are like talking about like redesigning D&D, I was kind of curious about like what we think about it and stuff.
No, it's good to think about like how you would try to make it healthy or something. I just feel like the durability thing, the best thing you can pretty much do is like, does it make sense for the weapon or piece of equipment or whatever to survive here? And if not, just it doesn't survive the attack.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes the most sense.
Something else that's cool about like Zabalba will be a sci-fi setting, so obviously guns of all different types are going to be pretty commonplace and easy to acquire. I would like to see maybe something along the lines of like every faction has their own engineering style and like types of guns. So if you're like a Keltar unit being deployed into an Ancifi battleground and your weapon gets destroyed, you still know how to shoot shit, and you've seen Ancifi use their guns. So if you go and take an Ancifi gun just to keep yourself going in the fight, then maybe you're not as proficient with the Ancifi weaponry, but you can become proficient with it if you keep using it over an extended period of time.
Yeah, like if
that's something I did in SS actually.
Okay.
Is I introduced new firearm types. There's exotic proficiencies have been reintroduced. There's exotic proficiencies for super heavy weapons, for mounted guns. And there's an engineering proficiency that translates into being able to operate a starship's guns. That's divided by the era. There's modern, there's cosmic, there's like generic. And there's different firearms like rocket launchers. There's the ballistic system that I had that even interacts with cover. And there's like, there's stuff that I haven't found yet, but there's also magic weapons. Like, absolutely having more variety to the weapon, the kind of ranged weapons and ammunition you get can go a long way. Where even just like the ammunition types, because like normally in D&D you have like the arrows and bolts. Well, now you're throwing like bullets, you're throwing rockets. I actually have different grades of ammunition. There's 10 millimeter, 12 millimeter, there's 30 millimeter, there's the rockets, grenades. You can not, even if you're not dealing with like weapons exploding on you, you can have different weapons or find different tools that you may prefer just because of how they work or how they work in certain terrain. Like a rocket launcher, maybe not something you really want to use when you've got a lot of like melee running into your face.
Yeah.
Maybe at that point you want to swap out to your pistols or your bullpup or something like that.
Yeah. No, for sure. Like the idea of there being a variety of the equipment and the gear, like that's actually something I wanted to tackle at some point somewhat soon is ironing out like what can actually be done. I mean, the thing about the Zabalba setting is like from the characters that you can choose to make, like from the races that you have available, you've got a very wide variety of physiologies. They're all broadly like like I guess they're besides the macrolon, they're all broadly like bipedal or whatever. I mean, the Githrovan have they're quadrupedal. They've got 4 legs.
How many of them have 3 tits?
0.
That's a shame.
That's not 3.
What a wasted opportunity.
So actually, one thing I wanted to also mention is when Keyan mentioned like this example of a Kelter warrior learning an Amphiphia weapon, right, and getting proficiency every time, it actually made me think that I wonder if skills shouldn't like atrophy if you don't like pursue them at all. Like if you learn to shoot an Amphiphia weapon, but then you stop using it at all, would you over time be worse at it?
I think it would be context sensitive because some things aren't very complicated. You just need to learn the initial piece.
The basics.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, I think if the weaponry is similar enough, like if it's not and it requires a bunch of extra stuff that your physiology can't compensate for, then I'm not even sure that you could learn a proficiency enough to make that make sense, right? Because, like...
Maybe you'd have like a hard cup, right?
Well, it just could be that like your physiology literally can't operate this gun at maximum efficiency because it's made for somebody with 4 arms. Like if it's a Perilli weapon and you've only got 2 arms, and you're also if your arms are big because the Perilli are small, like, well, good luck, man. Like that's not gonna like you might not even be able to use it at all at that point. Like depending on what the disparity is.
You got to carry around like a little hook that fits inside the trigger finger area.
Yeah.
Just sit there and pull.
Like the jerry-rigged setup of all time, basically, just to make the gun work. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that you would have to watch out for. And like, so some cases there's going to be conflicts. It's just kind of natural. But I do think that, I don't know. I think it's possible that we are able to put together some sort of system like that. But I just don't have much of a reason to... like have skills atrophy. Like everything that I can immediately think of, especially with regards to weaponry usage, is like it's not really that complicated. Or if it's too complicated for your physiology to even comprehend, then you probably can't learn a proficiency in it anyway. So I don't see why we would want to like remove that over time.
You also have to think about like how long in-game wise are you going to be running your game? Like atrophy would probably occur over a very long period of time. And SS, like I said before, we've been playing for like 6 years. And the in-game time, I'm pretty sure, is less than a month, or if it's more than a month, then it's not by much. So, you know, you definitely have to really carefully consider how much time is actually going to take to atrophy the skills, and you know what that would even apply to over that period of time. And I don't like doing time skips personally, even short term. But some people will just time skip by like a day or whatever, especially during travel. And it's like, I think those are wasted RP opportunities personally. So
I agree.
It's very rare for me to do even short-term time skips. So
I
think
like
that's something you should consider.
One good thing about like atrophy is that you can't max out your character fully, but then probably like most of it still would probably be role-playing even without atrophy. So like if you reach a mastery of some sort, then it probably doesn't make sense that you just like lose your skills.
Well, also on the role-playing angle, I mean, this is kind of a conflict that I'm not even sure if it's possible to resolve, and maybe it's fine if it doesn't get resolved, but like there's an intrinsically meta-contextual element to doing any sort of tabletop role-playing or role-playing at all, is that you're supposed to be your character, but like you have a list of things that you can remember, and then your character has a list of things that they remember in terms of their journal or knowledge base or whatever. And like you might still forget stuff as the player. Like that could happen. So if the primary way of testing skill is by testing like accuracy of role-playing and inventiveness and ingenuity and creativity, then yeah, if the player is not on their game, if they're maybe a little bit too tired, or if they've just forgotten this particular detail and they didn't bother to go and like check it, then like that could actually be pretty bad for them, and then they could like walk themselves into an area where they didn't expect it, and like maybe that would even be seen as kind of being out of character or whatever. But that's actually what we're testing for skill wise. So like it's kind of weird because you don't want to like meta it, you don't want to metagame it. Like that's going to be the advantage of the first time through, where people don't have like a complete there's nobody who's other than myself who is going to have like an encyclopedic knowledge of the setting because it's completely custom. So they're gonna have to learn a lot of things, and they're gonna have to like review some details and like ask questions and stuff. So that part is actually going to be pretty good. But like for subsequent playthroughs, if they know how like a macrolon works, for example, and then they like like, but their character isn't supposed to know that, then maybe they can still do something. But like at the same time, again, we're aiming for, people who we can just trust with honor system almost to like not really be metagaming too much, and ideally it also wouldn't be super impactful anyway, so we wouldn't have to worry about it.
There's a feat you can take in 5th edition called Keen Mind, which is basically just a cop out for what you were talking about. It's literally along the lines of like your character has such a short memory, they remember everything, and they can remember some things like in super detail for up to a month. And the campaign I'm watching, the wizard has it. And there's so many situations where he just looks at the DM and he's like, "Yeah, I can't remember what you said, but my character does." And the DM just looks at him, and then he like somberly begins to go through like 3 months worth of notes so he can find the thing that he told him like 10
Great.
seconds ago.
Yeah. Perfect.
We've had a few moments like that. In fact, this has probably not come up often enough because in several games we have people with like the wanderer background and stuff like that where they can like remember terrain like the back of their hand, and then they like get lost. Nobody remembers they actually have this, but at some point I'm going to look at their background and I'm like, oh, they actually should just remember where they are.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of like resolve stuff that would have been left to like checks. And yeah, it gets a little silly sometimes.
Yeah, well, I just look at that and I think like, I also agree with you, Mesk, that traveling is a big deal and shouldn't just be time skipped. I know some people are going to think that that's just the boring stuff, but to me, I think there's a lot of interesting room. I mean, especially considering you're going to be in this like vast vessel in this one shot that we're working on that is obviously in and of itself going to be like this interesting world to explore, and there's going to have all these different aspects to it. I feel like it would be really stupid if you skipped over those details, because to me that's like, we need to plan we don't know this ship and it's hostile to us to some degree, and like we need to explore it, and like it's going to be, although that's going to be part of the game. And but even when you're traveling across a more conventional, like, oh, let's just go down this road that we've gone down a bunch of times, like, well, the game master can do interesting things with the world. Obviously they can make it feel like a living world if it's a trade route or something. And you go through that and it's like, oh, there's like, traveling caravans of people like bringing their wares around or whatever, like that's more of a fantasy minded thing. But, there's tons of examples of that. And to just get rid of it entirely seems like a pretty big waste to me. I don't know why people just skip
It was
through
definitely a challenge in Auto Win because, like I said, it was a large province and I had maps for travel points. But to actually cover all the potential in-between points, I would have needed hundreds of maps.
Yeah.
And I had like one or two that weren't prepared, and it turns out we were going to have an encounter on one of these travel maps because of the way that things were resolving. And I was just lucky that I could prepare that between sessions, that we had ended a session where we would have run into that.
Oh, okay.
Because otherwise I would have had a lot of problems because I didn't have any in-between place. I would have had to bullshit something on a spot or very quickly slap something together in the middle. I wouldn't have been able to do like a night version of the map or whatever.
Yeah.
So it was, just like luck of the draw let me resolve that. But there are some cases where I haven't been able to, because in Autumn Winds, there was a distance between an area where they first encountered enemies and an area that they were traveling towards. But they didn't want to go that far. They wanted to stop and rest or do something in this off-screen area.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't prepare that ahead of time. I had to resolve it all off screen. And there was actually two cases that led to some confusion. Remember how I mentioned, I think it was on the big boys table, maybe in this too a little bit, where they got into a fight because someone died and the enemies took their body and they went up to a castle and there was thousands of lizards and they almost wiped there.
Yeah.
Part of the problem of this was there was a little bit of miscommunication where some people wanted to go into it and some people wanted to rest there, literally on their doorstep. But then they didn't realize that when they zone into the map, they are actually like already on the doorstep of this castle. In other words, they have to start making stealth checks and they have to hide immediately. And, some people, like when they zoned into that map, I remember Rollerskate saying that he just kind of accepted that they were there. And that was the case for the other people where they just kind of accepted they were there, but they wanted to go back, but nobody said anything. And so they kind of stayed there and then they got dragged into that fight. Because lo and behold, the enemy has rolled 20 on detecting them. And it was one of those cases where, like, because you did not have every single map to cover every single point, you led to this situation where you were thrust into this encounter because of the way the maps were designed. And in the other case, we're resolving a tremendous amount of stuff off screen, so we're basically just using theater of mind for a chunk of that. So it's just like one of those millions of cases where, like, the travel portion had bearing on both of those, even where one of them, it was a distance of like 40, 50 feet. That still would have had a bearing if we had something that represented that extra 40, 50 feet connecting these maps. And in the other place, it was a distance of probably like a couple kilometers, where we just didn't have a map for that. Where they were doing all kinds of stuff off screen, like they were actually shooting glowing arrows into this mist. And that's actually what draws the attention of the mage that gets stake killed to begin with. Because he scries, because they detected this glowing arrow entering their domain. And they scried, and the enemy, the party was able to detect the scry. And then that's what led Steg's character to going off to try to find them. And that's when other people are trying to scout a way to avoid an encounter. So it was just one of those cases where it's like, because we did not have a map representing every individual point, there was chunks of travel that did not really get played out in the way that it would have if there was. And when I look back at that, when I look back at Autumn Winds and I think about the travel, because we did short form much travel, when I had written it out, I expected every single part of the travel to be at risk of encounters. But then in the game, we didn't want to bog down the game with more and more fights that we knew they were going to win. It was just going to be a matter of them playing out. Mm-hmm. So I short formed it anyways on behalf of that as well. And, I felt like when I was looking at it, I was thinking there has to be some kind of middle ground we can reach where we can have the assets, where we can skip things we don't necessarily need to do, but we have the opportunity to role play things out when it comes up. And it really puts a lot of burden of preparation on you, even more than it already has, where like the assets for this stuff doesn't exist. I have to make them, which meant that I had to prepare probably like 24 extra maps at the beginning of the game, not even for the parts later on that I was really having issues with that I needed to prepare even more for, to confidently be able to answer this stuff. And it was already consuming a lot of time to do the preparation. So you definitely need a lot of planning ahead for this stuff to accommodate any of those decisions. Because when you short form any part of it, you do miss out on opportunities, and it can affect the influence of events really dramatically.
That's definitely, excuse me, something that when I look at the work ahead of me to make sure that everything works out, definitely want to find some way to visually represent things, because I feel like that's a huge help. But at the same time, like, I can probably prepare some text descriptions of a lot of the rooms and like maybe some whack-ass like lo-fi, low production value map or something. But I would just ideally have a lot of room to work with for that. And I don't know how easy that's going to be. So whenever we get around to actually starting this, and like I said in a recent episode of Prototype, I don't have an ETA for this because we're working on our demo and CMBW and all this other stuff. So I'm not really too like hell bent on it happening anytime soon, but it would be cool to get like at least a test session done or whatever and see like what the new rules are. And I guess that brings me to the last point, which is it's definitely way too, like, we're too far into this to talk about this wholesale. But I do want to talk about character progression and ways to improve characters and how they're set up. Like Keyan was starting to broach the subject of classes and stuff, or like customization in general. And I think we can definitely make like a whole show where we focus on that, or at the very least that can be like the opening topic. We can see where we go afterwards. But yeah, so since we're coming to the conclusion, I wanted to go around everybody and say, hey, you're at the fraudulent rotund table here. Any final thoughts on some of the stuff we talked about, or any other things you wanted to get in real quick? And I'll come to you first, Keyan.
On what you just mentioned, I just summarily say that I think more choices are better.
Right.
Anything you can do to give the player interesting ways to flavor and optimize what they can do is a plus in my book. And I would also just say, let me know if you do want to follow up on doing I can do a one shot sometime whenever we have time.
Yeah, Yeah, sure. If you can figure that out, I don't know who else. I guess Vik said he wanted to pop in for that too. So.
Yeah, I would join if there's
And I don't know if we did it on like as just like a replacement for an episode or something, maybe Mesk could join in too. I don't know if you'd want to do that, Mesk.
Possibly. I'll need some forward for that because I'll have to make a character and everything. So.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
other than that, thanks for having me on the show.
There you go. All right, Vik, hit us with your summary and final thoughts.
Well, it's good discussing this. I think definitely happy where this is going with everything that you have written down. It feels like a good distillation, I think, or whatever the word is, of what we have talked about. And I definitely like the turn and action system. I like the text prompt system, and I'm pretty much looking forward to actually having a client eventually.
Right.
But also looking forward to a game.
Yeah.
An actual session.
Yeah. Cool. And Mesk, my man, you have thoughts? Do you have feelings?
Pretty much very similar to Keyan is customization, expression, being able to make whatever vision you have actually function. Because with 5th edition, it's like you style stuff, but that doesn't really give you any actual sway over the game.
Yeah.
Like, in most cases that people are using like pistols or muskets, it's like, it's functionally a hand crossbow, but it's a gun. Trust me. And it's like, okay. But, you enter all these systems that now you gotta homebrew stuff to deal with bullets or whatever, as opposed to actually having a real, actual gun system in the game, for example. And that's just like a very simple example. It goes well beyond that. And progression, being able to emphasize those points, right? Being able to make those points stronger or whatever, And playing 5th edition, I don't think is going to give me much idea about that because it is so non-expressive. But it's going to show you how confined 5th edition is.
Yeah. I've never played a 5th edition game before, so it'll be a learning experience either way. Maybe not one that I'm looking forward to in terms of being wowed and surprised by how good everything is, but more like...
Again, I really recommend, if you've got the time, to go through my Autumn Wind series. It is heavy. It goes through a lot of stuff, everything that's happened in the last couple of years, but I talk a lot. I go through every session. I summarize every session. I talk a lot about the players and all the intricate details and decisions I made that were good, bad, what I could have done better, what they could have done better, what they did well, what was unexpected, stuff like that. So I think that's like as close as you can really get as to being in my mind when I'm running a long-running project. So it's might give you some insight.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe it would be useful. I feel like one of the biggest advantages or what have you of having an example to look at is just like, even if it's a bad example, like default 5th edition with no homebrew or anything, or very minimal stuff, it would be really nice if we just had some idea of what to do, or what not to do even. And like, I want to say it's possible for the overall experience to be like even generally positive or broadly positive, even in like a admittedly heavily modified 5th edition. So looking at your system, your set there would probably be useful for that. But beyond that, just thinking about like how I want to approach like different content creation and visualization. And I know you stream music to your players as well, and like finding ways to maybe set some sort of mise en scene instead of it being like, really over, like not very anything at all. It's just entirely theater of mind, where you might be, getting distracted by real life stuff, or you might be, being, whatever, like something else might be happening in your life, and then you're not really able to pay as much attention.
Yeah, pretty much every session in On a Wind, I am running with no sleep across multiple days. So that's like gonna be something I'm constantly complaining about. So
yeah,
look forward to that. Like that is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is running that project through all the shit that was going on. So
I bet. Well, I mean, even beyond that, like also you think about the players, like you as the game master really want to, and something that I said recently when I was like going over some examples of like, I really am sensitive to, I said this on the Big Boys table actually, I'm really sensitive to the idea that like the whole thing falls apart and feels like a farce or something stupid happened when it wasn't supposed to be like that, like it was supposed to be taken seriously. And that's the kind of thing that will, I think, significantly negatively impact the way that the game feels for the players. And, you know, maybe for them, some of them, they might just like brush it off and say, yeah, whatever, that's fine. And like move on to the next thing. But for me, that would be, I know as a player myself, if something slapstick happened, I'd be like taken out of it and it would take a while to get back into it. And maybe, and this sounds extreme, but maybe I would never fully get back into it because now there's the precedent of something really stupid happening in the game. And that means that something really stupid can happen again in the game. And like, that's probably one of the primary motivators to get rid of dice. But beyond the, like that side, I would just say, I think we are going in a broadly positive direction, the way that Vic was saying, like distilling it down, the thoughts and ideas into the action economy and the idea of proficiencies, adding more role-playing opportunities and less about like just random like dice padding and stuff. I think that's like a good move. Definitely need to work on the idea that like I don't want it to be super binary in the sense that it just like either works or it doesn't. It would be really great if we could have some sort of like partial success or gradations of success. Obviously, the example of hacking, like maybe you trip some antivirus or whatever, but you managed to get the thing over. Like that's like one example.
Oh no, you tripped Windows Defender. Now CMBW has been deleted.
Yep.
Again.
Oh no.
Better re-download, motherfuckers. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that you can do for sure. And I feel like it's maybe we're like sort of like when I was explaining. I think it was the proficiency system itself. Mesk was like, yeah, I just do that myself already in 5th edition. So that's the kind of thing is like, I don't want to get too in my own head and think, oh man, we're really like trailblazing and doing something nobody's ever done before, because that's probably not true. And just getting to the point where we can have a working system is more important than it being like original or whatever. But it would be nice to be able to say at the end of the day, we've got a much better service or a much better game environment or whatever than like any of these 5th edition things, or even, you know, like the things that are held in higher esteem, like Pathfinder, which I'm not nearly as familiar with. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things where I think the future is ours, so to speak. So I'm optimistic with that, and I think it'll be really neat, especially when we do get to the promised land of having an actual client, as Vic was saying. So yeah, hopefully everything will work out there. And then when we meet again, whenever that is, maybe in another 2 weeks or maybe just in the next week, we'll find some time to slap it together, and we'll have a gay old time talking about character progression. That's like a big thing that I want to do. Now, that's not as significant in the one shot or like the short adventures because they're short, so there's not as much progression to be had. But it would still be nice to like get some idea of what that might look like, so that you can at the very least get a taste of it when you're playing the short adventure. And then as you progress forward, it's like, okay, here's an experience where we get to have like, I don't know, like something that tells me, oh, if I were to play a longer campaign of this, a longer session of this, I could get further along the system. I could like, you know, really express myself, who I am, who my character is supposed to be. If we can do that, if we can like instill that confidence in the players and like start to explore that, even if it's a little bit fraudulent because we don't yet know exactly how all the details will work together. Like if we can at least set the ground rules and set the bar at this level and say like, you can at least be this expressive and it's already better than 5th edition, then I think that's a thumbs up move. And sort of like CMBW to the other RTS games, it's just like, it's already, you know, a cut above in that respect. And, you know, obviously we just got to work on like some, like the rough edges or whatever. And hopefully that ends up working out. So I guess that'll do it. Yeah. Smoke weed, I guess. GG.
Smoke weed.
Smoke weed.